Can we get the approval? Are you okay? Oh, okay. Can we get approval of the minutes, please?
So moved.
Okay, we have Weston and Brenda? Yeah. Okay, Brenda?
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Abstain.
Adrian?
Yes.
Weston?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Clark?
Yes.
Andres?
I abstain.
Okay, the minutes are approved. The chair has nothing to report, and the vice chair isn't here. So the director? Or the next director?
I have no director's report, other than this is the only meeting of this month, so we will see you all in January.
Okay, then we'll move on to the first item, Broadway Apartments Conditional Building and Site Design.
Okay, so Lance Howell and Studio PBA Architects, representing the property owner, are requesting conditional building and site design approval for additional height to accommodate the construction of a 256-unit apartment building at approximately 336 East 200 South, which you can see on the screen here. The tallest point of the proposed building will be approximately 91 feet 1.5 inches, which is measured to the top of the rooftop amenity rooms above the primary roof line of the proposed building. Buildings in the RMU residential mixed-use zoning district where this project is located are permitted up to 75 feet tall outright and up to 125 feet tall with conditional building and site design approval. As you can see from this aerial, the subject property runs the length of the block, and the proposed building will front both 200 South and 300 South. Two smaller lots at 327 East 300 South and 327 South Dubai Court will also be consolidated with this main lot and are included in the project. Here are images of those two street frontages that I mentioned, 200 South and 300 South. The main lot is vacant, and the structures on the smaller lots that you can kind of see in these photos will be removed. For context, big lots, the retailer is located to the left on the 200 South image, and then to the right is the violin school. Again, the tallest point of the proposed building will be in its center, and that will measure 91 feet 1.5 inches. And this is measured from average finished grade in the center of the site to the top of the amenity spaces on the top of the roof, as you can see kind of circled in pink there. I do want to clarify that the staff report indicates the highest point will be 98 feet 6 inches. However, that's taken from their benchmark elevation, which is not where we're going to measure from. That's taken from the lowest point on the site. We're going to measure from the average grade here. So it's 91 feet 1 inches tall at its tallest point. I also want to point out that the height of the two building faces, let me switch back to that, and most of the building's roof line actually falls below 75 feet. So you can see there, one of the facades measures 72 feet 9 inches, and the other is at 67 feet 5 inches. The conditional building and site design process is intended to help ensure that newly developed properties and redeveloped properties are designed to encourage pedestrian access, circulation, and orientation, while also encouraging or acknowledging the need for transit and automobile access. So with this in mind, staff encouraged the applicant to try and relocate the parking garage entries and exits from the front facades to the side of the building. However, because the lot is relatively narrow and due to existing easements that run along the different sides of the building, the applicants indicated that relocating those entries on the front facades really wasn't feasible, besides the one exit that's located on the west side off of 300 South. So here's a rendering of the 300 South or Broadway ground floor level. Since their initial submittal, the applicants have worked to increase pedestrian interaction on both the street-facing ground floors by incorporating active uses on these floors and introducing more glass, interesting landscape, and public art pieces. So you can see kind of those public art pieces on the building and in the park strips. And then they've also introduced a mural on the facade off of 200 South, which you can kind of see there. Looking at the 200 South elevation in particular, one of the standards for conditional building and site design reads, "Architectural detailing shall be included on the ground floor to emphasize the pedestrian level of the building." So staff does feel that the ground floor off of 200 South in particular could be better distinguished from the upper levels of the building and is recommending this specific condition that architectural detailing shall be added on the 200 South facade to terminate or distinguish the base of the building from the upper stories and reduce the sense of apparent height. So they could add some kind of coping or a freeze band, something of that nature, and staff can work with the applicants to accomplish that. So with that, one condition, staff is recommending approval of the project. Thank you.
So Lauren, in the staff report, you were also recommending putting the entrance to the garages further back. Are you removing that condition?
That was never a condition. It's something that we suggested the applicants do, but it wasn't a specific condition because we do feel that the one condition with kind of defining that 200 South ground floor helps to meet that one standard. But it was a suggestion, and at this time, it's not going to be pushed back.
This is related tangentially a little bit. I'm just curious about the parcel. Has that always been one parcel like that, or have multiple parcels been combined?
I believe it's always been one parcel, as it is now, and it was owned by the United States. I think it might have been a post office parcel, but the applicants might be able to speak to the previous ownership. But yeah, it's always been configured that way, from what I understand.
And I know generally, and I'm not sure if we do here, but I know generally we have rules about street frontage length. I'm guessing we don't have any if it goes internal the block or the depth length. That's not problematic from a zoning perspective?
Yeah, there's no rules about the actual depth of the lot. The building, we want building faces to be broken up in terms of architectural detailing, so the length of those faces on the west and east sides, and they are being broken up. So yeah, they're meeting that in terms of design standards, but the lot itself, there's no regulation for that since it is an existing lot.
And the parcels to the west are the same zone, correct?
Yeah, the whole block, pretty much the whole block, I believe, is RMU.
Is there any, I wish that I had paid attention a little bit more as we drove on 300 West today during the field trip. I think we drove on 300 West, or 300 East. But are the buildings that are there, are they likely, are they historic structures? Or are they likely to be, the reason I'm asking is sort of the height, I guess, is more of a concern for me when we're looking at how it towers over those buildings there to the west, and I'm trying to remember what it looked like.
Yeah.
It's more just curiosity. I'm not sure that it's necessarily under our purview, but
I think there's like a bunch of condos, like older, turn of the century
okay.
type of thing, or
All
apartment
right,
buildings.
that answers my question. All right, thanks.
Are you talking in the staff report a little bit about a mid-block crossing between Third South and Second South? It seems like this building, maybe we get it future somewhere else. But it seems like it would completely block off the opportunity for us to ever go from Third East to Fourth East with some sort of mid-block crossing or mid-block what? Is there any plans for the city to try to make a connection in that sort of way too, or is that not a consideration here?
Yeah, I think you're right. It does kind of prevent that from happening east to west, but we don't have that marked off as a specific area where we have mapped a mid-block walkway. We were working with them to try to get a walkway from north to south. But because the property is quite narrow and due to the access easements along the different sides, it was hard for them to accommodate a big enough space for that walkway. But in the other direction, yeah, it's just not something that the city has mapped out, I guess.
And was there ever any discussion about, I guess so it would be an east-west, is it, going north, going east and west? Was there a discussion about?
We didn't
trying to do
discuss that because
access through the building or some option in the future to figure out if there's ever a way to?
yeah, we didn't discuss that. The opportunity we saw, since they own that entire parcel, was north to south, and there's multiple parcel property owners going the other ways. So we really didn't discuss that opportunity. Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions for Lauren? Okay, thank you, Lauren. We'll bring the applicant up. State your name for the record, and you have 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. Hello, my name is Robert Miller. I'm with Studio PBA. We are at 1575 Gilpin Street. We are the architect, Gilpin Street, Denver, Colorado. We are the architect for the project. I think just to address some of the things or the questions that were raised during your questioning of Lauren before I talk specifically about the architecture. The east-west connection, I think, would be extremely problematic because there is quite a bit that's already been developed along 300 East without that connection through those properties. And obviously, it would bifurcate our site and create a public use easement through the middle of our site, which would greatly hinder that site. Additionally, on the north-south, I think we discussed that with Lauren and with planning staff. We are concerned because, once again, we are a very narrow lot. So to do it right, to do it well, so that it is safe and hospitable for people to truly utilize, would require 10 feet of our site at a minimum, and probably something closer to 15 feet, somewhere in that range, in order to create a safe environment that would be a burden completely on our site until potentially maybe other sites were able to join in on that. And it really creates a dimensional problem with us, with our garage, because of the width of our site. It would make it so that we would have very inefficient or be unable to park certain areas of our site. Additionally, we have a private a driveway that we're sharing partial access with the Oxford Apartments. They have a historical easement, so to speak, on that site where their cars access Oxford Apartments. So it would be sharing a driveway with them currently. So there were a number of different reasons why it was very impractical on this site for us to completely share that burden of that north-south connection. I think if it were to develop into the future, there is land along our side that I think once it would develop, we would be interested in having it, encouraging it and improving our edge so that it could accommodate that or join with that if that's something that does develop within this block in the north-south condition. Excuse me, Trey. Okay. So this is the perspective looking north from Broadway or 300 South, and then once again looking north from 300 South at the building. We have a two-story concrete podium on this level. We decided to embrace the beauty of the concrete. We're doing board form concrete at the base here, as well as providing a grade enhancement to the public way at this location. So we are bringing in our signage, a lot of planting, bicycle racks, and integrating it all together into one hardscape solution here. We also have our leasing center directly here. We also have a kind of a co-working office type of environment going on the second floor that comes down with a stairway into the first floor. So we think that this will be activated and utilized throughout both the day and the evening hours. It's the main entry lobby into our building, so all visitors will be coming in this way. They can also come in off of 200 South as well. And the interior design, the interior and exterior design really work well together. You can see some of the interior design through this rendering. We really bring out a lot of that materiality into the hardscape in the public way. Planting materials, et cetera, that's submitted as part of this package. And then you can see the leasing space environment here, the co-office working environment going on up here, library looking down into that space, a two-story fireplace coming up through the space. So as you walk by this building, it's going to just be a beautiful, gorgeous building that's going to light and energize the street. Then as we get to the 200 South side, once again, here we have a one-story podium because we have a 10-foot change in grade between the north side and the south side of this building. So here you're seeing that one-story expression of that concrete. We bring that beautiful material once again out to the street. Board form concrete. So this isn't the cold, hard concrete that you're used to seeing like in an office building. This is going to have texture. It's going to have warmth because of the board form nature of the architecture. I'll pause here for a moment and just talk through one issue. So Lauren, I thought we had made this clear in our plans, but our garage doors are recessed back 20 to 25 feet inside the building. We do have the garage entry on this side. Dubai Court is here. It's a private drive with a cross-access agreement. We had originally planned to come into the building from this side, but through negotiations with the violin school, they were very concerned about our traffic intermingling with their traffic when they have recitals and concerts. So we made an agreement with them that we wouldn't take our residential traffic onto Dubai Court. It was part of a negotiation with them because they had some rights further within the site that would have prevented us from being able to do this building. So through this negotiation, we agreed to take our residential traffic off of Dubai Court and put it and have our garage entry come in off of 200 South. This is one of the many complicated deals that have had to happen in order to make this project happen. The owner of the Oxford Apartments is here as well, and she could tell you about all the negotiations that we've had with her as well, trying to work through access issues, easement issues, electrical undergrounding issues. It's numerous, and this is a complicated, tough site. So that's one reason why we have both entries into our garage here, both the in and the out here. But once again, we do recess those doors far back. So they are 25 feet within the building. They're not right on the street edge. And we bring that concrete materiality back into that space as well. So we have a continuity of design here. So once again, talking about engagement here. So we have a dog wash here, and then we bring some bone benches out here and a little dog sculpture here. So once again, we're connecting that indoor and that outdoor space together. So this is a place where the residents will be able to wash their dogs and then bring them outside and go for a walk, or go for a walk and bring them back inside at the dog wash. We've got a bicycle repair shop right here and a ski waxing shop right here. And we bring our bicycle parking here as well. So once again, we've put a lot of uses onto this street, and we've maxed out the amount of transparency that we can do here. Everything that's concrete here has to be there structurally. We didn't add any extraneous concrete at this location. And we think that that concrete's going to just be a beautiful, interesting, engaging material. Then we have our building entry at this location here. We integrate planters into here, and then we're proposing, once again, a mural that will speak to the violin school, be a musical themed mural. So once again, we're kind of integrating this into the neighborhood and working with the neighborhood to make sure that our project fits in with the context. So you can see some of these uses, some of these interior spaces that we're going to be providing inside the building, the dog wash, the graphics are going to be on the wall in the dog wash. Also, mail will be in the back of that lobby as well. So once again, you're going to see people coming and going in and out of this lobby for this project. And then, as Lauren had mentioned, we are less than 75 feet. As you can see from either streets, right? From 300 South or from 200 South, those elevations are less than the 75-foot building height. The only place we are over the 75-foot building height is in the middle of the building, in the middle of that block, so it's 200 feet inside the block from either of those two streets. Walking by on the street, you're never going to see that height. And the reason for that height specifically is to provide a rooftop amenity. So there will be a club room up there, there will be a little indoor-outdoor room, a spa, a pool, and then a pool deck up there. And one of the main guidances in the code for allowing additional height in this zone is to create an engaged rooftop deck environment. So the code is specifically written to allow for this type of environment to exist and for that to be a reason to allow us to go exceed the 75-foot building height limitation. I believe with that, that's all we have to say. Glad to hear any questions or comments.
Talk me through the decision to make this like one building, kind of, end to end, street front to street front, rather than two separate buildings, or or breaking it up a little bit. Like why does it end up as a better project because it's one building rather than different buildings and structures?
That's a great question, and the driver of it is parking. So because we have the grade to enter into a lower level parking garage from the 300 South side and an upper level parking garage side from the 200 South side, that allows this building to occur. Without that, the width of the site wouldn't support having an internal ramp. So we couldn't achieve the parking that we need to achieve for this project without being able to drive into the high and the low side from either side and being able to drive all the way over to the other side. So that's the primary reason why it works well as one building.
And what are you parked at?
We are parked just below the code maximum. I forget off the top of my head what that maximum is, but we are just slightly under the code maximum.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Where will your trash receptacles, and will you also be doing recycling?
Yes, we will be doing recycling, and the trash, that was the one use that was negotiated with the violin store. They were okay with us bringing our loading and our trash off of Dubai Court. So that's actually buried all the way back into that kind of middle portion of the building It's internal to the building, and then we have some garage doors there that will bring and people will come bring the trash out when the trash dumpster's there. So it won't be seen or have any impact upon 200 or 300 South.
Have any concerns with any of the recommendations proposed by staff?
I believe that we have done a really great job with the building architecture here. We think we've done a great job on making a contemporary, urban apartment living building. I don't think that the 200 South Side will be benefited from an additional cornice or frieze line at that location. I think that there is a great break but already exists between the base, the human scaled base, and the top that's above that. So I don't believe that there's additional architectural language that's necessary there to further create a break there. I believe it's pretty broken already. So I would ask that, if possible, that would not be a condition of approval. But if it is a condition of approval, we will work with staff to make that happen.
Talk me through the parking a little bit more and why you chose to go with the maximum instead of a minimum. That's just different from most of the developers that have come through in this part of town.
Well, the maximum is not terribly high, historically speaking, where people are now with cars. Once again, I forget these numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it is right around one parking space per bedroom, or even slightly less than one parking space per bedroom.
You've got 245, according to your plans, spaces provided with 128 being required. So you're substantially over the minimum for sure.
Right, but we're actually less than one parking space per unit.
Per unit.
So that is, from a economic viability standpoint, the first thing that will drive people away and not have them renew their lease is the inability to park. So from an economic standpoint, going that low to less than half the amount of cars as there are units in the building would not functionally work for the management company.
And what's the price point of these kind of units? Are they?
They will be a market rate, so they will probably start off somewhere in the $1,800 range and go up from there to $2,400, $2,500 a month.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll have you step back and we'll do the public meeting.
Great, thank you.
Actually, sorry, I'm just,
Oh,
sorry.
stick
slow
around.
to formulate
Wake up.
questions here. So am I hearing there is no low income or no affordable housing in here? It's all market rate.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. This is one of the biggest developments we're seeing in this area. That's a huge building that's surprising. Usually most of them do have some, but that's something to think about, I guess. But thank you.
Thank you.
Have you thought about having any low affordable housing?
That's really a question for the developer. Once again, from the land costs to the cost of construction to trying to put together a complicated deal like this and then going to the financial markets in order to be able to get this type of project financed. That requires them to run performance, which are based upon certain rents and certain rents per square foot. And achieving those goals is what allows them to be able to build this project. So providing for lower rents in a way that isn't supported financially by some other methodology isn't supported by the financial markets in order to achieve a building like this.
No.
Once again, I'm speaking for them. I can only suppose that this is the methodology that they looked at in order to answer this question.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? I have a late thought here, Clark.
I'm good for now.
Okay. Okay, we'll open the public hearing on this item. So anybody from the community council here? No? Anybody from the public that would like to come up and speak on this particular project? No one. If you want to speak on this, please come up, state your name for the record, and you have 2 minutes.
My name is Matthew Burnett. I own probably the smallest lot on this block. I don't have huge concerns, and maybe this is minutia for them, but number one is I think having a garage entrance going onto 300 South, and I know they kind of had to do this, but I don't think the people who designed that have spent much time on 300 South. It's single lane each way, there's bike lanes each way, there's parking. There's already, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a lot of backup of traffic on that road. So, in understanding that we need or want urban development, I think that really needs to be looked at as how they're going to manage that garage entrance on 300 South. And the other little detail, and I didn't catch who you were or who you were representing, but I suggest you not have a dog wash. I know it's cute, but if you've ever been in that area at 7 o'clock and after on a summer evening, you're just going to get homeless that are already an issue there, but they're going to wash, they're going to defecate. It's going to be, that dog wash is not going to be an attractive site for you. So who's ever developing this site, I think they should spend some time in the neighborhood and see not only the homeless, the low-income people, and the small business that live there too, as well as the high-end residents in the area. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and invite staff and the applicant to come back up. And I would ask the applicant, do you have a response to the guy's concern about traffic backups on 300 South?
So first of all, on 300 South, we are sharing access with the car wash that is already established use there. So we are, and that was part of the many ways in which we were trying to thread a needle here, was trying to create some shared access. We weren't able to make it work with the Oxford Apartments for a number of different reasons, including the grade there, but we were able to make it work for the buildings that front 300 East. So we have tried to incorporate that because our garages actually don't communicate, the two levels don't communicate. Only half of the apartment traffic is going on to 300 South, and only half of it is going on to 200 South. So I think that that's going to help with those concerns as well. But then additionally, this is a dense residential project in an area of the city that is looking to develop towards dense residential development. It is not terribly far from City Creek, and the traffic that exits in and out of City Creek, et cetera. And all of that is part of living in a city and navigating streets within a city. So we absolutely respect the bicycle lanes. That's part of the attraction for this project at this location is the bicycle lanes, and we've enhanced that and we've embraced that. So we will do everything in our part to make sure that is a safe interaction. And then, if I may, on the issue of the dog wash, the water and the facilities to actually wash the dog will be inside the building. behind key fob access. So the homeless won't have, or anyone else won't have access to water at that location. And furthermore, I think having a frontage that is lit 24 hours a day with people coming in and out will also help address some of that concern and issue as well, and improve that street.
Question for staff. So the zoning ordinance requires an RMU open space that's not less than 20% of the lot area. And we've used the rooftop as that space.
Yeah.
Is
And
that common to use the rooftop as open space?
I worked with other staff members on that, and we have done that before in past projects, and it can be approved through kind of this conditional building and site design process. I don't know personally of another project that's done that, but that's what they're doing here. Yeah.
And so there is a feeling that a rooftop deck will comply, and that seems like a scary precedent to set for the city. But and then you feel, I mean, then also in the staff report under the standards for conditional site review, it also talks about these public areas. And I mean, so it requires 1 square foot of plaza, park, or public space for every 10 square feet of gross building floor area. But are we just ignoring that?
That's something that should probably be amended in our code, and it's something that's commonly not waived, but reduced through this conditional building and site design process, because it's quite a high standard, and something that urban developments like this that don't have very high open space requirements, and they can build to property lines and things of that nature, and they can cover a lot of the lot. They tend not to have a lot of that public space on the lot, so it is something that's commonly reduced through this process. And like I said, we should probably revise that standard.
Or whether or not RMU is the most appropriate zone for the area.
Sure.
So the standards then listed in attachment E, CBSRD standards. You're telling me that these are more guidelines than actual standards that need to be followed? If we're able to amend them as we...
No, they are standards, but we've set a precedent that for those things in particular that we've reduced them before, essentially.
Well, it seems like we're almost ignoring this one. Okay, thank you.
My question is to my statement I said earlier, and in the same standards, and now I've lost it, of course. Oh, here we are. So this is in the site design review, standard KB, and it says no new buildings or contiguous group of buildings shall exceed a combined building length of 300 feet. And then, which my question earlier was, does that not pertain to interior running buildings? Because what's the length? What's the front yard? What's the side yard? We talk about it all the time. And you comment on there that the interior facade of this building is longer than 300 feet, but that it has been broken up architecturally to create lots of interest along these long walls. So is that then making the argument that it does need to be broken up, and that your argument is that the zigzag in the middle of the building is sufficiently addresses that issue of being so long?
Yeah, I think the intent of that standard is not to have a long blank wall. And so here they do provide really interesting architecturally detailed walls with different forms of articulation in terms of being recessed and windows. So we do feel that their proposal meets that standard.
But it does need to adhere to that, even though that is not the block face, and it's going into the block. That still must adhere to that standard of 300 feet. So we may disagree with you that is sufficiently breaking up the 300-foot building, and that is under our purview.
Yeah, I'm trying to find where that standard is.
Maybe while you're finding that, the architect can tell me, what is the length of the building to the zag on each side? Do you know what I mean? Like, so from 300 East to the center of the building where it kind of turns up again, what is that length, and what's the length from that point to 200 South?
So it's more or less at the mid-block. They both slightly overlap each other a little bit. So I don't have that number memorized off the top of my head, but I would say it's somewhere in the 220 to 240 foot length.
So our blocks aren't the downtown blocks 660?
Yeah.
660 feet?
Yeah, it's 660. Yeah,
So this would be 330 roughly.
right. And
A little bit
yeah,
longer than 330 because it's each side's longer than. Yeah.
And there, in this area, there isn't any required, if this was two buildings, there would not be a required backyard setback, right? These buildings could abut each other.
I don't believe the RMU has a rear yard setback, no. Yeah.
So
and
it kind
then-
of doesn't matter if they could essentially build two buildings and have them butt up against each other, right?
But you.
Well, it
still
matters
the
if it's
open space requirements and restrictions and the.
Well, that's another issue. I mean,
Yeah, I think, so, sorry, the screens are coming back alive. Apologize while we wait for this to happen. But as you can see here, so there's a length here that is probably somewhere in the range of 80 feet long. Then we have a 12-foot step back in the building. Then we have an area here that is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 200 feet long. Then we have another 80-foot chunk here that is stepped back out again. This is just only as an example of the ways in which, we haven't just provided a blank wall along these facades, that even at the lengths of the 330 feet, each leg is 330 feet, but then there's a barbell at each end. And I think that substantially breaks up the architecture of
It's
this
a
building.
beautifully designed building. I do want to, I'll say that, like the look is, compared to a lot of stuff we see coming through here, it looks really nice, in my opinion.
And I do want to correct myself. There is a rear yard setback requirement of 25% of the lot depth, but need not exceed 30 feet. So there would technically be, if they had a rear yard, but they don't, there would be a 30-foot setback.
Anyone else? Brenda?
So I,
Okay.
just
okay.
just for the architect, I mean, just so generally, because at least my comments in our discussion with the commission are going to center around the length of the building and how it's one big long building, right? And that it seems like we're not, some of my concerns are that we're not meeting some of the open space requirements, that we're missing opportunities for mid-block crossings or things in the future. And I want you to respond real quick. I mean, we went to a little bit, but really, because I think it's going to be important, at least for my consideration, other than the parking that people can drive through and you get people, because I think if you split it up, you could still fix the parking problem. Talk to me really, like, why is it so important that this building is end to end, third south to second south, and that's the best, that's really what we need to do here, is to build this one big long building.
So there's two responses, I think, to this. The first of which is whether in the diagram of the city, if this block wanted a mid-block, whether that mid-block would want to be east-west as opposed to north-south. And I think when you look at the geography of the other lot lines or the other parcels on this, it does suggest a more north-south connection, not an east-west connection. And that's true, throughout Salt Lake City as the grid swaps back and forth. So I think that's the first comment, is that just breaking this up east to west doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to effectively get an east to west connection. Second of all, this project has amenities that are shared with all the residents. So breaking the building in the middle and creating it so that I have to leave the building to go to a different building to get to my amenity would be a concern and would create inefficiency for the building and for the residents that live there. Furthermore, you know, to talk about the issue of safety, bringing that, you know, if the goal is to get to an east-west mid-block connection and bringing some amount of that pedestrian traffic into the middle of our project, then creates a perception of a concern of safety for those residents. As I'd be going from one side to the other to go to the pool, I wouldn't feel safe in that environment potentially. That weighs heavily on a great number of the renters. The fact that this is one building that's all connected together, that there's security to get into the building, creates that safety and creates that environment that will be more leasable. I think holistically looking at this block, this is a great block of the city. There's a lot going on in this block that's already there. I think the violin school's amazing. I think the commercial on 300 South is amazing. I think the Oxford Apartments is a neat old little building, right? But it's got character. And I think our building is going to enhance this block. It's going to bring people to this block. It's going to make these businesses more viable. It's going to bring pedestrian traffic. There are going to be people living right next door that will be able to go to these restaurants and go to these shop fronts and engage with those shop fronts. This is going to make this block a safer block. It's going to bring development and a huge amount of investment and money into this block. And Big Lots is going to follow suit. I mean, Big Lots lease is going to be up in a couple of years, and someone is going to develop that. So this block is going to become something special. And I believe this building, with its limited impact that it has on these two streets, I mean, we only have about 80 feet of frontage on 200 and 300 South, and I think we've done a great job of making an exclamation mark on both of these streets. And you see this building, you will see this building as you drive by, and you will know that something's happening on this block. And I think that improvement, that embetterment of this block is something that can't be lost sight of. So do I think that there could possibly at some junction be a great mid-block crossing here? I think it could potentially develop depending upon the will of other people and other partners that we have no control over. Do I think that it should be east-west? I don't think the geography of the block really supports the east-west connection. I think the existing buildings that are probably not going to go anywhere on 400 South for quite some, or 300 East are probably not going to go anywhere for quite some time. So I think if it develops, it wants to develop on the north-south corridor. I think it wants to occur on the east side of our project, and I think that we'd be willing partners if the right plan came into place to make that street, that mid-block connection viable, safe, with eyes on it, and embrace it. The block isn't there yet at this juncture.
And I would agree that going from the north-south mid-block will happen because there's so much other vacant lot and parking lots and everything else. Like, to me, I'm not concerned about you guys not including that in your project because there's so many other opportunities that are available.
And, I know that playing the developer card isn't a popular card to play, right? But these things are not easily financed. We've spent a lot of money, we've dedicated a lot of money to the improvement of the public way here. We've put the money onto the street. The enhancements that we are showing in this package are far and above what the standards call for. We have done that because that is where we think the public realm will see the most benefit to that money. Placing this money and this enhancement in the middle of the block is not going to be something that at this juncture in the foreseeable future, in the next 2-3 years, is going to be an enhancement to the public good, where the money we have placed directly enhances the design and enhances the street frontage on two very prominent streets here in Salt Lake City. So we feel like we have done our part to make this block a great block, both with our building architecture, but then also in what we are proposing to do in the public right-of-way here. This is not land we own. We are enhancing the public right-of-way. We are providing street benches here. We are providing plantings. We are providing bicycle parking sculptures. We're providing bone-shaped sculpture benches. I mean, there's a lot that we're doing here to make this a really interesting street frontage. And I think that the rest of the people who will further develop this block will follow suit in those goals.
Thank you. I appreciate your response.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Lauren, could you respond to his comments about your recommendation for a condition about the additional architectural detailing on 200 South?
Sure. Yeah. Going through this, the street frontages, the ground floor of each facade of the building is obviously something that we're really trying to work to enhance with this process in particular, conditional building and site design in particular. And they did make changes and upgrades, including adding more glass, putting those active uses on the ground floor, things of that nature. But the one thing that kind of stuck out to us was that just the facade off of 200 South just was kind of not as well defined as the upper floors, and if there could be some kind of architectural detailing to really give a solid base to this tall building, and really say that this is the ground floor, this is the pedestrian entry. That's what we were going for with that standard. And we feel like we might be able to work with the applicant to get there, but if you feel like it meets the standards as is, that is totally acceptable too.
So if I had to comment on that particular request, I don't think it has to do, the sort of understatedness of those ground floors does not have to do with detailing. It has to do with height. Those things are only 8.5 feet tall or 9 feet from floor to floor. You know, that's not even a parking garage height. So a ground floor traditionally in a building, especially in a residential building, would be up to 12 feet floor to floor, and 8 feet's just not going to cut it. So I know that's a much bigger change than adding a few details on the windows, but this is a very stingy looking entry, and will be a stingy looking entry, and I don't think you want that on a really nice building anyway.
I have a question for staff. I see the comments from YWCA. Did you receive any comments from the violin shop or school that's next to the door?
No, we didn't. We just got that one comment from the YWCA.
Okay, thank you.
Lauren, I'm glad that Matt brought up the open space component, because I think it's important that we clear this up for this project and going forward, because I know it's a concern of mine, and it's a concern that I hear generally from people about, that we are adding a lot of people and a lot of density into our city, and that's going to continue to tax our open spaces and our parks and whatnot. So the intent of the public space, do we know, is that intended to be just for the residents of the project, or is that intended to be public space for the use of everybody?
Public spaces, yeah, for everybody. And so since they are able to, per the zoning standards, cover a lot of that lot, it's difficult to accommodate public space on the site. So in lieu of that, they work to add these different features kind of in front of the building, the benches, the public art, the kind of metal art pieces, the public mural they added, to kind of, again, in lieu of that public space on the
So
site.
rather than adding square footage, they're just adding amenities to the existing square footage. even though the standard seems to indicate that it requires the square footage be added.
Yeah, and that would be something that's kind of modified through this process.
Go
If
ahead.
it's only available to residents, how can it be called public space? I actually thought it was just open space, but I looked here and it is public space. I'm corrected. So I think this is kind of contingent on what they've decided to develop. They have a lot that goes clear across a block, so they're not required to have a backyard. They're wanting an entire building rather than two separate buildings, which if this was, any of the other lots on this block are broken up to only have half the block, kind of. And I'm not, that's just what they have, so they're able to.
What is the
play
gross
that to
square
their
foot of the
advantage, I
building?
guess.
What is the gross square feet of this building? What would be the open space requirement if we actually followed it?
The open space requirement, well, so there's open space and then there's the public space. I think we're talking really about the public space.
Well,
with-
let's talk about both of them.
And so the public space requirement is very, very specific.
20%.
Sorry, it's K,
What is it? I just saw it.
using that. So,
One
1 square foot of
for
plaza,
10.
park, or public space shall be required for every 10 square feet of gross building floor area.
Okay, so what is the gross building floor area?
I don't have that in front of me, the gross square footage.
It's the architect now?
Yeah, off the top of my head, it would be in the order of magnitude of somewhere around 280,000 square feet.
Okay.
That's not taking the garage, so I don't know if that's
That would be
standard plus.
28,000 square feet of public space requirement for a building that large, right?
Right.
Why are we just waiving that?
We've determined on the staff level that this requirement is, it's very obviously difficult to meet, and it's just been something that we've waived in the past, is my understanding. So, but we did push them to try to do these enhancements for the public in the parkway and things of that nature. So there's kind of conflicting standards because you can, cover the lot in this urban area, which we do want to see developed, but then we're requiring these really stringent square footages for all this open space. So we have these conflicting standards, and we did try to work with them to get those public spaces in the front of the building.
If I can interject, the standard K public space requirement that you're discussing was developed to try and get public space out of more big box style development and not try and carve out like a public park out of a more urban condition such as this site, or really any site, in more of a downtown, dense urban environment. So in the past and on many projects that this body has seen, we have recommended waiving that standard for projects where we intend for that building to be built close or at the property line, which is what this proposal is.
Thank you. Is there, do we have any record of having, are we making a change in the standards for this, Molly, or is this just?
We are. So the draft ordinance is with the attorney's office and moving its way to the city council for consideration.
Is
I
there
think
a
you discussed
separate
it last
requirement
spring.
for open space versus public space?
There's a separate requirement for open space in the RMU district, and it's 20%. And we've determined that they can use some of their rooftop space for that open space because it's a green type of rooftop
So
space.
20% of the area of the
lot.
And how much would that be? How many square feet would that be?
I don't think I have that
The
exact.
lot is 75,473
So
square feet.
20% of that would be in the 15,000,
9,175 square feet.
right?
That's what's in the report.
Yeah, and the staff report has them at 22% open space. And that was my question, whether or not we
Based
have
on
traditionally included.
using the rooftop as an open
And that was my question, whether we
space.
traditionally use
Yeah, and
a rooftop as open space.
the standard does say that open space may take form of landscaped yards or plazas and courtyards, subject to this site plan approval. So I think we've
A
kind of,
Rooftop would be, well, depending on your definition of a yard or plaza, I guess.
So can I speak? Okay, sorry. So I know that historically, through projects that we've taken before through Salt Lake City in front of this body, you have counted the podium level courtyards that are sitting on top of garage, oftentimes elevated above the street level to count towards this open space.
Which were some of those projects that you brought through, just to help?
Like Sugarmont Apartments being a prime example of that. So our open space was counted by having the elevated, in this case, about 30 feet above the street level, both along McClellan and along Sugarmont. Those rooftop decks are, or those roofs over, we have townhomes fronting the two streets. Those rooftops, which are
I remember
fully
struggling with
developed.
that one. I remember struggling with that one, too.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But my
remember
point
that.
here is that it's not just a rooftop, right? I mean, it's a pool, it's a spa, it's seating, it's plantings, it's grills. So it
Active space
functions.
intended to be used, yeah.
Right, whether it's at grade or whether it's 70 feet up in the air, it functions in the same way for the residents of the building. In this case, because it's 70 feet up in the air, it also accomplishes the goal of activating the rooftops, which is part of the standard, as well as making it just a great amenity for the building. It will be more used than if it was buried into the middle of our site at grade with, 5 stories of shadows falling upon it.
Questions? No? Why don't you guys go ahead and step back, and we'll bring it to the commission for discussion. Or a motion?
I think what tends to bother me a lot about this project is the fact that it is very large, very long, completely covers the site with almost no relief whatsoever from the site boundaries, has no open space to speak of, and certainly nothing that would actually grow on the site, like trees or something like that, except at the very narrow ends of the property. And I think it's exactly the kind of project that we get that causes a lot of complaints about about this density of housing, because on the face of it, it just looks enormous and immense from the street, from the side, from any other direction you look at it. And because of that, sort of waiving all of the open space requirements and waiving all of the public space requirements bothers me a great deal. Not to mention the fact that you do have to have these garage entrances on both ends of the site facing the street, which we also, in other words, there are so many ways in which this developer has been allowed or encouraged to not meet the conditional use requirements, that the fact that this is such a, you might be able to justify that with a smaller project. With something this big, I think it makes for a bad precedent. And I kind of have to agree with the YWCA's comments that this is just a very, it doesn't have a human scale, and it doesn't have, and it's got a large volume of people. And so we would have, normally our criteria, our conditional use requirements would actually stop it from being this big.
Or it could go higher.
It could go higher, and it could be less of a,
Less of a
footprint.
mass, but it could
Yeah,
be,
the footprint's huge.
which I would be more supportive of.
And so it's a lot of concrete. There's no green space. There's nothing to breathe on this site. So yes, you might be able to swim or something, but or or play if you're on the if you're a resident. But there's no affordability, and I don't think that. So my tendency would be to deny this project based on the fact that it violates so many of these standards that would otherwise have kept it from being such an immense project.
I think you've put it really well. I agree. I think this, to me, kind of comes down to just how the applicant has decided to design and use a huge piece of property. We see a lot of other projects that get broken up a lot differently. I'm not here to prescribe how they design, but I do think the scale of this building is what makes all these things seem more important in this project, where perhaps we have waived open space for smaller buildings in the past, but I think just the sheer scale of this has a larger impact.
So Molly, the public space requirement has been eliminated from the RMU zones going forward?
Sorry. No, the public space requirement that I was referring to was the one, standard K, in the conditional building and site design review.
You mean the 300-foot component?
Nope. Standard
No, the
K.
1 foot for every 10 feet of gross building
Right,
area.
so that's for public space, right?
But the,
And that's,
Yeah.
RMU,
That's not the RMU. That's for
Oh.
any project through the design review
Okay.
process.
but I'm sorry, yeah, not RMU, but going forward, that has been eliminated from that standard? Or that standard has been eliminated?
Well, you are recommending
Okay.
removing it, yes.
Okay. I mean, I want to agree with Brenda's comments. And I'm concerned, I am growing more and more concerned about open space and public space as we densify. We love going to Liberty Park, and I've definitely seen it get busier and busier and busier as we add more and more people to our city, and we need to be very cognizant as we go forward, as we add these large projects, that we're offering open space and public space for people. I'm less concerned about I'm getting my words mixed up, but the open space for the rooftop, I think, if that's intended to be space for the residents, then I don't really care where it is. I think there's a lot of design elements to this building that I like. I think if we are applying that 300-foot maximum for the depth of this building, I don't think that the 12-foot jog in the building satisfies that standard to break up the 300-foot facade, and adds to that huge visible mass that I think is problematic. So.
Any other comments?
I would just caution us from requiring public space in the nature of parks to be imposed on private development. If that's a concern of the city, I think it's something the city needs to look at in its park master plans, and we don't put that burden on applicants when they come before us.
Well, I'm not asking them to make a public park, but if we've put in the standard historically that we have public space, then we need to have a justification as to why we are removing public space, whether that's a plaza or whatever, some sort of.
But this is the one standard that will not be part of this zoning.
but we're dealing with the one that's before us today.
I know, I'm just saying, I would just caution us from not imposing burdens that should be placed on the city itself as opposed to private developers. That's my only comment on that. And I would also say this lot is challenging. I mean, we can't change the fact that it's one lot. I mean, if it were 2 lots, I think it would be a lot easier to do a kind of project that we all have in mind, where it's smaller in scale. Perhaps there's more setback, there's a rear yard setback, so the mass is not what it is. But they've got 1 lot. So I just would say there are constraints to this lot that I think, I agree they're asking us to waive certain requirements, but there are also issues that we should take into consideration.
I mean, it could be 2 lots, or,
Not,
and I would say too, I mean, the developer with Sugarmont, with different issues with it, but there is intentionally, because there's a walkway that kind of curves off and goes from where the streetcar kind of goes, with intended for people to walk through, that is done and developed by the private developer and maintained for the use of people getting through that big sugar house block to the streetcar. And so we
right,
do
but
have
you-
some
but
precedent
that
with using
makes sense.
plazas and open
Right,
space.
in that setting, that would totally make sense. Here, where are people going to be going, either east-west, there's, you've got the wine store and you've got Big Lots.
Well, I think the big challenge with this one is that unfortunately this lot, this block more than many others is more of a blank slate than other downtown blocks, because Big Lots is clearly going to come down. But when you look at what we've done over on, with the projects we just reviewed off of the public safety building, and how you have streets that come up the center and then kind of cross back and forth, and we're essentially ending any opportunity for an east-west potential, because this building will be here for 50, 75 years.
But again, there's nothing in a city plan that says area has been identified for an east-west walkway. And we've got buildings that are already there there are no plans to redevelop them. I think we just should not impose burdens on private developers when the reality is it's not their obligation.
But we do have a stated policy and a goal to try to break up our blocks.
Agreed. And in here, they've discussed doing north-south, and I think that makes sense, given how the lot lines work and how the buildings work and how the area will be redeveloped. All I'm saying is we be reasonable when we think through those kinds of burdens that we're imposing on the private applicants.
Okay.
I kind of agree, and I suggest, and actually staff suggested in an earlier letter, that actually, a north-south public walkway through that site, especially a well-landscaped one, could provide a great deal of sort of interesting public space for that property. And while the applicant has agreed that this might be something to do in the future, the reason they're not doing it now is because they've made the building so large that it squeezes that potential side.
It's a narrow lot. I mean, I think it'd be hard to, but they are saying that, like, hopefully in the future, somebody else
could do
east
it
of
with
them
them.
will solve this
Yeah.
problem.
But I think sort of reserving that as some kind of a public right-of-way or something might be helpful. I just think that's a way of sort of solving this problem without a total. When we're talking about making a 3-foot, 4-foot dimensional change, not tearing a building down. And I don't know what the parking. The architect indicated that it was the parking garage dimensions, which are, I know, very tricky. They don't have a lot of flexibility. But we didn't get a parking garage level plan.
I'll make a motion, Madam Chair. Based on the findings listed in the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing, I move the Planning Commission deny conditional building and site design request PLN PCM 2018-00390 because the evidence presented demonstrates the proposal does not comply with the following standards. And I would say standard, hold on, it's going to take a while to open and get back to that. Okay, so RMU zoning standard, open space requirements, and CBSR standard K. Regarding public spaces.
And a second. Okay, we have a motion by Matt, second by Brenda. Andres.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm kind of, this is one of those cases where I'm kind of torn. I do like the architectural design of this building, unlike many others that I've seen through this commission. I definitely applaud the work that he's done. What was mentioned before by Commissioner Brenda and also by Commissioner Matt, they do make sense as well. However, I think he does meet those standards, at least minimally. There are those issues that were brought up. I do agree with open space, but I think he's done a very nice work at presenting it, and his argument really, I think, meets that basic standard in my case, so I'll vote no.
Okay. Clark.
I think I'm going to vote yes.
Okay. Matt.
I really like the design. I think the architecture of this project is great. I think it fits in the area. I think you could go higher to help solve some of the other issues. I mean, at least within the zoning standards, it permits a higher building, and so I think that would fit that area, which would solve some of these other questions. But I'll vote yes.
Thank you. Weston.
Yes.
Adrian.
No.
Carolyn.
Yes.
Amy.
Yes.
Brenda.
Yes.
We have 6 yeses, so motion passes. Thank you. So let's move on to the text amendments for the TSA zoning. Doug.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm Doug. I'm not going to read the staff report to you, but I'll start at sort of the 30,000-foot level and get down to the detail of why the recommendation is what it is. Planning's not a hard science. If you take a math class and they say 2 + 2 is 6, you probably should get a new math teacher. Or figure out if they're still working in base 10 or whatever. But planning is a social science, and there's no one right answer, no one way to get there to it. And the reason I mention that is the TSA zones are transit station areas, and they were developed in response to light rail going in on North Temple and 4th South. Both of those streets used to be very auto-oriented. 4th South is still US 40, kind of the unfinished quadrant of I-215. It still carries lots of traffic. North Temple was one of the last, oh, thank you. I'm not technology savvy. Last sections of I-80 to finish, and it was just recently, when light rail was put in at UDOT, donated the street, well, I guess donate's not the right word, conveyed the street to the city, and it's now a city street, but it still carries a lot of traffic. So the concept of facilitating those streets from a transition to from highway orientation to more pedestrian and transient oriented is still a very good concept, but when you start getting down to the details, you have to come up with some different nuances, which is why in the TSA zone, we have subcategories for every station or group of stations. For example, some of the details around the 8th East station are different than what they are around the 3rd or the 2nd East station on 4th South. Likewise, the 8th West station is a TSA urban neighborhood subcategory, where the stations to the west portion of North Temple, specifically the Cornell 1950 and 2200 West stations, are in what's called the mixed-use economic center zone. Further, from those subcategories, we acknowledge that there's a difference between being right at the station and being a couple of blocks away from the station. And we divide it into core versus transition. So the specific request here is to amend the TSA MUEC transitional zoning to allow drive-through windows, not the core, just the transition. So on this map, the darker solid blue is core, but this hashed blue is transitional. So you'll notice around the stations is core here, core here, core here, and the transitional happens a little bit on the west side of 215, but the most of it's right around the North Temple Redwood Road intersection. So I kind of went from the big TSA down to just this district. So the easy response is, well, this is transit, no drive-through windows, no cars. But you kind of you start massaging the nuances, and is a hardcore response really the appropriate one? Part of what went into the thinking of staff coming up with this recommendation is we've modified TSA zonings as we figured out what has worked and what hasn't worked. Some of the first buildings that went up on 4th South were nice, but they had blank facades, and after the fact, we've modified TSA to prevent that kind of thing. And part of one thing that sort of changed my thinking on how we should respond to this was an incident on, or a development on 4th South at about 4th East, where drive-through windows for restaurants are not allowed. So when you have a rare commodity, it becomes more valuable, and there's still a lot of cars on 4th South. So Starbucks bought an old Taco Bell just because it had a non-conforming drive-through, and we're having an apartment building built around it, when maybe it might have been better if we let them integrate it into a more urban building. Is our hard line having unintended consequences by making non-conforming uses dig in? So that was one of my thought patterns. And also, when you look at the master plan for the North Temple corridor, it pretty much acknowledges that this intersection here at North Temple and Redwood Road is still pretty auto-oriented. It's a freeway off-ramp. It's a major north-south auto corridor. And you look at many of the land uses just in the TSA MUEC transitional, there's still drive-through restaurants, truck stops, that kind of thing. Now, it is transitioning to urban, and we're getting some really nice apartments on North Temple, and there's some others going in on Redwood Road. And I guess I should back up at this point. I should have started out. This petition was initiated by Lori Hendricks, representing Bike LLC, Gaddis Investments, because they own a property at the corner of North Temple and Redwood Road. And they had asked that we amend the zoning ordinance to allow drive-through windows for restaurants. We already allow drive-through windows for financial institutions in this subcategory. Not only this subcategory here, but also in the transitional for the special purpose TSA, which is over along 10th West. So there are at least, oops, what did I do? There are at least a couple of transitional areas on North Temple already that allow drive-through windows for financial institutions. So I asked Ms. Hendricks if they could look at their site and see if they could actually design something that would meet sort of urban design standards of having all the drive-through in the rear or the not front yard portions. And that's what you have in the staff report as an example of what they did, of how they could make an urban development with a drive-through. The idea of being more like Chick-fil-A and Sugar House, that from 21st South reads very urban as opposed to a more traditional drive-through. So the staff recommendation, after that long, tedious story, was that we allow, as a permitted use, restaurants with drive-through windows in the mixed-use economic center transitional zoning, which is only mapped in the area that I showed you around Redwood Road and North Temple, and then a small amount west of 215. But also, we suggested putting into the land use table some criteria that specifically says, you know, all of this activity has to take place in the side or rear of the building, that you can't have the drive-through in the front yard and that kind of thing. So we were trying to come up with a reasonable alternative of accommodating development and still facilitate a more movement towards urbanism. So I either really bored you or answered all your questions.
There's got to be some questions for Doug. Come on.
I think he did definitely answer my questions. I thought his presentation was well thought out, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we have no applicant for this, right? Or
Applicant is here.
okay, we'll have them come up.
No, okay, yep, sorry.
You have to come up to the microphone so you can be on record. If you'll give us your name and...
Lori Hendricks. I manage property for Gaddis Investments, and I'm here with Therese Walton, and she's one of the owners of the company. We have about 40 properties across the Utah and a few properties outside of Utah, and this is the first time we've asked for anything like this. And the reason we're here asking is because we feel like we've exhausted everything we've tried. We were really excited about the opportunity to have this property back and about the opportunity of what's happening in that area. We own Pibbs Exchange and Sugar House and Patagonia, and we really embrace the neighborhood interaction, and we were hoping that we would have that happen here. But it's been almost 2 years now, and we've been marketing aggressively, and I can show you, I don't know if you have this. I did a poster showing who's looking and who isn't. Oh, right here. It's fast food drive-throughs. We had Beans and Brews was very interested, and we felt like that would be a welcoming, nice addition to the neighborhood, but we weren't able to do that, and they left the table because they insisted on having a drive-through with it. Also, we've looked at the banks. Mountain America was very interested, but they couldn't make, our lot is very small, and they couldn't make it fit on that lot. So if you have any other questions, let me know. But we also did do, like Doug said, some renderings using the suggestions, and I think it looks very nice. And we're hoping for that kind of a look. Thanks, Doug.
I put this in your staff report.
Yeah, those are in the staff report. Any other questions for the applicant? No? Seeing none, would you step back and we'll go to the public hearing. We'll open the public hearing on this item. I have a card from Judy Short. Come on up.
Judy, are you speaking on behalf of a community council?
Yes.
Okay. 5 minutes.
His staff report does indicate that he came to the Land Use Committee and we discussed the issues surrounding this. I've known Doug a long time. I know he's been a planner forever. I respectfully disagree with his conclusions. The purpose of that TSA zone is to promote pedestrians and transit. I think a drive-through is counterproductive. It produces more curb cuts and cars in and out across sidewalks. Doesn't make it walkable or safe for pedestrians. I don't think it promotes sustainability, which is one of our city goals, because cars are idling. You can't turn your car on and off. I mean, you could, but it's the turning it on and off that generates the most bad stuff in the air. So I think it's counterproductive. And it disrupts the traffic flow. Doug used Chick-fil-A as an example, and I think that's a horrible example. You have to snake around the building. Yes, it goes around behind, but what it does is creates about 6 cars on 21st South, and you know how freely that traffic doesn't move. So we've got 6 cars in the right lane, 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning, 11:30 to 1 o'clock at noon, and again about 5:30. It doesn't work. And the reason Chick-fil-A was permitted was because the Carl's Jr. across the street already had a drive-through, and that was grandfathered from 100 years before. So once you put this in place, you can't ever stop it. I think, this is radical, but I think if the owner changes, the drive-through permission should be extinct through the city. Now that's my personal one. The Land Use Committee didn't talk about this. But this is supposed to be a mixed-use employment center. People should be able to safely walk to coffee shops, not dodge cars. So I'd really like to see in the future, you look to see a way that you can reduce more drive-throughs all over the city. I don't think they're helping us. I understand the retailer, but come on. We're supposed to be walking, using transit. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Is there anyone else here who would like to speak on this item? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Bring it back to the commission. Do we need Doug to come up and?
I kind of have a question for Doug.
Okay, Doug, come on up.
I'm just curious about the rationale, if you know or have any guesses as to why bank drive-throughs were allowed when other drive-throughs were not. If our philosophy was to not have drive-throughs, but that's okay, but those aren't okay. It just all seems all mixed up.
I wasn't involved in that decision originally. I think.
But Judy said you've been a planner forever, I think. She
True,
said.
but I haven't been involved in every.
Okay, fair enough.
From what I understand, though, there was some thought patterns that financial institutions don't generate as much drive-through as a restaurant would. So it's not as impactful. At the same time, when we received this petition and we're talking about internally, it's like, well, that may be an assumption, but I've gone to lots of banks that have lots of cars at the drive-through. And I think Judy's right in terms of Chick-fil-A and Sugar House. It varies from use to use to use, because some coffee shops, drive-through coffee, can get by with a 2-car stacking. Chick-fil-A, to their credit, does a booming business, and they could have 30 cars stacking and still have a line. Just because of who they are. And so when I praised them, I was talking about their presentation from the sidewalk, from the street, how it appears urban. So back to your question, I think that was one of the original thoughts, that financial institutions don't have as much traffic, but it was a topic of discussion of, is that really true?
Why was this area chosen? Why was MUEC TSA chosen for here rather than the other TSA kind of subzones?
Based on the subcategories of the TSA were try to differentiate the different personalities of stops. And this is the mixed-use employment center by and large because it's the state office campus. The Cornell Light Rail Station accesses the agriculture and where you get your birth certificates and natural resources. The next station is the taxes. And so it tends to be more of an office campus than the special purpose district, which is around the Fair Park, which is different than the 8th West one, which is more of a neighborhood residential orientation.
Because my question, what I'm getting is that to me this seems appropriate for this area, but would we ever apply the MUEC zone in other places near transit? I mean, is there ever a chance that like along 4th South would get rezoned along that deal, or that West Temple would be rezoned?
Yeah, I've worked here a long time, and one thing I've never developed is ability to see that far into the future. Anybody can ask for anything, so it's entirely possible that somebody will ask. But to be honest with you, if we already have subcategories for the existing streets that have light rail on them. So if we got another light rail line somewhere and decided to change that to TSA, based on previous behavior, I imagine we would write a sub-district in response to each of the stations along that line rather than just take one that we already have.
Because to me, the key defining feature of this area is the access to 2 different freeways.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's unique for cars, right? People are driving cars if you've got access to different freeways in those areas, which would make it seem more appropriate that you'd have a drive-through area that people would use while getting on and off the freeway. But like along 4 South, it would seem less because but yeah, anyway, to me that's what seems unique about this area.
And in the end, that's what it came down to, because in terms of transportation areas, the philosophy is more transit, more pedestrian oriented, but we already have many subcategories. And this particular subcategory was
Always
the
gonna have
most
cars, lots of cars coming down.
yeah, more than the other subcategories.
Yes.
And it already allowed certain drive-throughs.
Are the bank drive-throughs allowed on 4 South too?
I don't believe there's a subcategory that allows them on, but there's a bunch of non-conforming ones that exist.
For sure.
Madam Chair, I'm ready to make a motion if there's not more discussion.
Any discussion?
Yeah, I wanted to make some comments. They weren't questions for Doug.
Hold that thought.
So I truly appreciate you articulating your thought process on this. It's very helpful. And I've written a bunch of notes as I've been thinking about this. So I live right by that Chick-fil-A. I experience it multiple times a day. And Chick-fil-A did not want to do the drive-through back there. They wanted it to circumvent the street to the front of the building. That was the Planning Commission's compromise. So when we talk about this philosophy that it's a car-driven street, 2100 South is definitely car-driven. And especially during rush hour, cars are backed out of that parking lot onto 21st South. And so traffic doesn't move. And so it creates a problem. And I don't necessarily I'm not in real life seeing this relationship of, well, we have a car-driven, busy street. This makes sense. We should put a drive-through there, because in reality, what's happening is creating problems for that traffic to flow. And then, thusly, because I live on the north side of that street, it creates a lot of problems to try to cross it as a pedestrian. And so it creates problems to try to cross the street. It creates problems on the sidewalk as you're trying to walk, because cars are in and out. They don't follow the rules. They want to go where they want to go. And so I guess it becomes, to me, this balance of what are we trying to create? A pedestrian-friendly area. And in my experience where I live, the drive-throughs are not conducive to pedestrian safety or pedestrian activity in a good way, but not 24 hours a day. Certainly there are times of the day when it's fine. And that's the balance for me. Like, what's our vision? And do we compromise our vision because we're stuck in a mode of thinking, well, we're all still in our cars? Well, I'm trying to get out of my car where I live, and it becomes really hard. And so then I almost can't. I'm almost forced to get in my car just to cross 21st South. And so I don't know if we're accomplishing a vision when we're stuck in a mentality of like, well, we're all still in our cars. And I don't know if we're helping traffic flow by putting drive-throughs on busy streets, because that's not what I see happening. I don't see good things happening from that.
I'll say, Doug, that I think your thought process is really good, and I was almost convinced to agree with you, because I do think you make a very strong argument. But kind of what Amy's saying, and I have, pre-kids, I was militantly opposed to drive-throughs, because get out of your car, right? No big deal. Now that I have kids, it is it is more complicated. That said, I also have kids, and they are growing up in this dirty air world, and I know it's a small part, but it's a part. We all have to keep, I think the philosophy behind this wasn't necessarily, is this where cars are or not cars? It's more of a general philosophy that we need to eliminate as many places where people are idling their cars as possible. And so I think this is on that taking a step backwards that I probably am unwilling to take with you. But I appreciate the thought process.
I actually agree with Doug's reasoning here, and I do think that a coffee shop or even a Chick-fil-A in this location, designed somewhat like the one that we have here, would be a much better addition to the street life of that street than just about anything else that we might be able to reasonably put there at this time. This is placed as a transition area, and I hope that means that in the future we will be tightening up the requirements for this area as it develops more. But transition means that we're not quite there yet in terms of taking it to the highest level of pedestrianism. I must also point out that to be on the back of this site means you're actually entering it from Redwood Road, which has 22,000 cars per hour on it. So I think we're not really looking at a pedestrian-oriented street. And if you're walking to this particular coffee shop or location, you will be walking along North Temple, which means you will not be crossing the drive-through lane.
So maybe to follow up with that, Brenda and Doug. So I feel like, I don't know how you would accomplish this in a text amendment, because the promotion of the pedestrian activity is on North Temple, and if the drive-through is located, entrance and exit is located off of North Temple, then I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But I guess, can you accomplish that in a text amendment where you identify the road that you're trying to activate in the TSA, and that drive-throughs, as long as they're not entering and exiting off of that road, are permitted? Because I have less heartburn or indigestion or any bad feeling of them doing it off of Redwood Road, because that's not the road we're trying to activate pedestrian-wise.
And I'll respond by saying, yes, you, that kind of detail could be put into this because, for example, we build some, in many different places in the city, we build some very unique criteria based on where it's mapped. And the fact that the MUEC is not mapped all over, but just here, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but what I put in the footnote of the land use table.
Oh, man, Doug. The footnote.
It was.
I have to go back to that. I don't necessarily remember what you wrote there.
Yeah, was that it be behind the front plane of the building, and there's no activity in the front of the building, which push things into the back. But because this is very, you could get to the level of, in that footnote, say the access has to be off of
Yeah, so I
such and
mean, I
such
think when
street.
I read that, I was thinking of Chick-fil-A because that's where I live, is that I like that it's, yeah, you have this urban connection, but it's the entrance and exit. And I don't know that, you know, we have identified that to me, North Temple is the street we're trying to activate pedestrian-wise because of the TSA. And if we were able, I don't want to do a text amendment that allows then for entrance and exits off of those main streets where we're trying to have that pedestrian activity based on transit.
Yes, and
No, I'm.
Yeah, how is that different from, for a parking lot?
As a parking lot.
Well, because a parking lot isn't generating the kind of traffic that you're seeing through a drive-through, and I live it every day, so I know the difference.
in this particular circumstance at North Temple and Redwood Road, for example, North Temple has light rail down the center, so if you had your access off North Temple, it's going to be right in, right out. You can't get across lanes. And with the double left turn lanes on Redwood Road, it's a UDOT road, and so you have similar type of access issues with this particular site.
Yeah,
now, there's
I'm
other
also
places
thinking about not seeing the future and not knowing where this zone may pop up in some other area in the city. So I'm also considering that, which may be configured differently, where you could have, you know, in and out differently.
And I guess I would respond to that by saying, if this zone popped up somewhere else in the city, you and the city council would have to make that decision. And at that time, part of the discussion is, are these criteria we have in it now appropriate in this expanded area?
So then, Doug, I guess I was looking at it as, okay, so say this zone pops up somewhere in the city in the future. It's just a use we've amended the text, and so it's permitted, and you're saying that we would actually, I just thought it wouldn't ever come before any decision-making body again.
Oh, if this zone pops up in the city, it's because you recommended it pops up somewhere.
I know, but then we wouldn't necessarily look through all of the conditions and be like, well, we don't want drive-through there.
But I think
Or
if
what
you're
we won't.
looking, say we wanted to zone Foothill Boulevard at 13th South, TSA, in part of your deliberations, you would go, are all these things appropriate for that location? And if they're not, you could make the appropriate changes at that time. Because you have to make a conscious decision to expand this zone anywhere else.
Is there a reason you did permitted instead of conditional?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Because originally I was going to go down the conditional route because it would give the planning commission a review of anything that came in. But, and my thought process there was a conditional use is really a permitted use by state law unless there are things that can't be mitigated. And the argument for having it as a conditional use is that you would get to see it. And
But
then
we
you
could
could talk
maybe
about
address some of
this
Amy's
stuff.
concerns about cars backing up onto the street, too many people, flow, view sites, so people walking aren't being hit by a car. I mean, a conditional use would allow us to address those concerns.
Yes. the conditional use criteria tend to be
Yeah.
impact-oriented rather than design-oriented. So if you were more comfortable saying, we recommend doing a conditional use, because then we could review every single one that came through here in terms of its impacts, that is certainly a valid response.
I personally feel more comfortable with that. That's why because I'm not against trying to help businesses succeed. And I recognize that some business models just are very adamant they must have a drive-through or they'll literally implode. I feel more comfortable with the conditional use, and not because I want to see everything come before us. It's not about that controlling, but I think if we are trying to create a city with a specific vision for specific areas, like a TSA area, and we're trying to create more pedestrian-friendly areas, we can't just do some blanket things that are allowing activities that I expressly and daily see thwart pedestrian activity and pedestrian safety. So I'm in favor of a conditional use only because I want to look at those balances in these very special zoning areas. In this particular instance, if the entrance and exit is off of Redwood Road, I am much more inclined to say, like, that's fine, than it being on North Temple itself. That's my personal take on this as I try to balance all of these different values and visions and potential things where this zone could pop up somewhere in the future. So I think that's my position.
I think a conditional use probably makes sense especially for this area where we're currently talking about. This is the only area that zoning exists. That stretch of North Temple already has a lot of drive-throughs, so we're not doing away with the drive-throughs there by changing anything here, but we can kind of more specifically review each of them as they come up, maybe make some site recommendations based on where they're at, and I think that this is definitely never going to be a super walkable area. I've walked out there. I live out there.
So Clark, I would challenge that. I mean, I think that same view probably existed for Sugar House 10, 15, 20 years ago.
I walked around Sugar House my entire high school. I don't know. I mean, that was 20
I mean, I've
years
lived there
ago.
for 20 years, and it has its challenges. But are we ever going to get to a different future if we just say, we'll never get there?
Along that stretch, on the other side of those buildings, there's a huge refinery. I mean,
But that's
it's
not going to be there forever
super-
either.
It's what?
Doubt that'll be there forever either. I'm just challenging
Okay.
this mentality of, well, it'll always be there, or this will never change, or we have drive-throughs there, but that doesn't mean they're going to be there forever. If there's anything I've learned in the 20 years I've lived in Sugar House, was this idea that something that's there would be there forever, because the changes have been immense.
Madam Chair, I'd like to make a motion.
So,
Please do.
Based on the information, the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing of the Planning Commission for a positive recommendation to City Council regarding PLN PCM 2018-00575, with the following modifications: that the change be listed as conditional instead of permitted.
I'll second that.
Brenda? Motion by Matt, second by Brenda. Let's start with Brenda. Amy?
yes.
Carolyn?
Agree.
Adrian?
Yes.
Weston?
I'm a no.
Matt?
Yes.
Clark?
Yes.
Andreas?
I will vote yes.
Sorry, Weston, the ayes have it.
I usually
The motion
lose.
passes.
It's fine.
I'm never going to get a unanimous one, ever.
Okay, let's move on to item number 3, the D1 self-storage zoning text amendment. Doug, you're up again.
Oh, thanks. Okay, another text amendment. Same kind of philosophical turmoil on my part. The petition is to allow self-storage units in the D1 zone. and I'll get the flow right this time. The petitioner was Bruce Bingham of Hamilton Partners, who own 324 South State, which is the old Arbex building. That's what it'll always be known to me, but it's been an office building for 20-something years now. Hamilton also owns several other high-rises in the downtown. The genesis of their request is it's a former department store, very deep floor plates. The back offices are far from street frontage with windows and stuff, and it has a basement. The basement used to have a health club in it. The health club has since moved over here across the street, and so it sat empty for a while, and so they requested that we amend the D1 ordinance to allow self-storage. And in their request, they talked about, they're just concerned about the basement, taking up that space and allow storage. Now, you can already do on-site storage. So if you had an office in the building and stored it in the basement, that's on-site. What they're asking for is to market as sort of retail storage. It's kind of the difference between on-site parking and a commercial parking lot where you're renting it out. The first knee-jerk response is, this is downtown. It's supposed to be active and busy and high density, and storage units don't really add to that. But in sort of bigger terms, offices that grow, they need storage off-site because they can't hold everything. People will downsize their homes when they move to a high-rise condo downtown, and they went from 6,000 square feet to 1,500 square feet, and they still want to have access to their Christmas ornaments. So there has developed a market for storage units in the downtown area. There is a really large, exclusive self-storage complex at 5th West and First South. First South? Yeah, First South. That one is in the GMU zoning district, and it really doesn't allow self-storage, but it was a warehouse to begin with, so it maintained its non-conforming status and went from a warehouse to self-storage. And their market has been people that live in the apartments and condos in Gateway and West Downtown. There's also been, in the last 10 years, a big self-storage warehouse at 5th West and 6th South, which, again, covers that market. And so part of the question is it better to have big storage warehouses around downtown, or maybe integrate smaller things into other buildings downtown? And so we went back to their original request, and it was really just to convert basements to self-storage. Their request was that 80% of it had to be below ground. The final recommendation from staff was the storage is underground, and the things you can have above ground is your leasing and sales office and that kind of stuff. But that's how my recommendation differed from their request. But ultimately, how I arrived at that decision was most basements in the downtown are used for parking or storage or other uses anyhow, and allowing them to be used as self-storage units was not going to impact the urban design at the first floor or the upper levels. I looked at some other cities, and I was a bit surprised that Denver allows self-storage in their downtown, and they have some design criteria. Their criteria is basically the units can't be accessed from the street, and most of these self-storage places now put their hallways on the outside, so you can see through the windows and see people in the building. But they do that because they don't want the storage units next to the windows, so that people look in and see all your old skis and stuff. By just restricting it to below ground, we didn't get into any of these urban design issues, and it seemed like a legitimate use for otherwise dead spaces. And whereas Salt Lake City's blocks are 660 feet, We get lots of buildings that have deep floor plates. It's not like Portland where 200-foot blocks, and so everything is sort of on a street frontage. So you get places like the back of 324 South State that's way far away from the street and it's not accessing. So again, I'm rambling, but that's the bottom line. Recommended permitted, but with a footnote that said underground only except for the leasing and office space.
Questions for Doug?
Yeah, Doug, I have a question on this one. Is there anything in a tangential code that would regulate for, like fire and access that aren't in this text amendment but would be applicable to allowing something in the basement area?
Absolutely. Normally those things, we try to be compatible with building and fire, try to be really strongly compatible with building and fire codes, but the zoning code kind of regulates land use, and so when they went in to take out a building permit to convert, in this case, an old health club to storage units, the fire code's going to step in and say you have to have this kind of sprinklers and all of that kind of
that's
stuff.
what I was just wondering if that would kick in and whatnot. So
It would
thanks.
kick in at the building permit level.
Okay, thanks.
But you bring up a good management issue. You don't want somebody storing their LP gas tanks in the basement of your building. But that really becomes, an attorney's office in the building could do something bad now. I'm not bad-mouthing attorneys. But any office, but that becomes a management of your storage where they're going to have to be strict about what they can and can't have in there and how they manage it.
I assume there must be industry standards related to that for every storage unit, so.
Is a basement always by definition below grade? Or are we duplicative in that phrasing, or is it the same?
No.
Are they different?
Yes, it's below grade, but we'll allow it to poke out to like 3 feet. So you'll see different apartments around town where the first level is like 3 or 4 feet above the ground. And they raise them in part, a lot of times when there's parking below, so they can have venting for the parking, so they lift the building slightly for the first level. So we count the first level. Once it starts getting above 3.5, 4 feet, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there is a line there where we say there's a difference between a basement and a first floor. So the literal answer, it could poke up a bit, but not more than half of my height.
Madam Chair, just a point of information. Basement as defined in the zoning code is a story wherein each exterior wall is 50% or more below grade. For purposes of establishing building height, a basement shall not count toward the maximum number of stories allowed, and the exposed portion of the basement wall shall not exceed 5 feet.
So 5 feet.
Thank you. More questions for Doug? The applicant here? Come on up, state your name for the record. You have 10 minutes.
I'm Bruce Bingham with Hamilton Partners. Thank you very much for hearing our petition. With me is Tim Stevens, one of my associates. We'd be happy to respond to any questions you have.
Questions for the applicant?
So I'm just curious for this particular one, being an old department store and that, and would somebody who's going to store something there access it?
It's a very good question, and we've got a very good answer, I think.
Well, those are the answers I like the best.
As many of the streets in Salt Lake City, we have a mid-block street in the middle of this large block, Exchange Place. It comes off of 400 South, then turns east and hits State Street. It's only a half block one way and a quarter of a block the other. Our parking garage for 324 South State Street fronts on Exchange Place. Next to that parking garage, and between that and the adjacent building, is a long ramp that leads down to our basement. So we don't have to park any trucks on streets for unloading or anything like that. They would be positioned in this ramp out of view of everything, really. And we think that it was one of the keys that seemed to make this work better than a lot of other situations, because we had that kind of an access facility.
Yeah, that does seem very ideal.
Anything else for the applicant? Okay.
Thank you so much.
You got off lightly. Step on back. I'll open the public hearing on this D1 self-storage zoning text amendment. And is there anyone from the community council? And I have a card from Judy. Come on up.
The Sugar House Community Council thinks this is a good idea. But I'm not sure that it goes far enough. In Sugar House, a lot of the new apartments have a cube, I don't know how big it is, but a storage cube space for each of the residents, because they need to put their bikes and other things. And our concern was, as apartments seem to be getting smaller and smaller, that there may be more demand, and maybe it should be allowed that perhaps an apartment building might carve up an apartment, as long as it doesn't face the street, but an apartment in the back for storage units. In other words, retrofit storage units in some existing buildings rather than make this for all just new construction. We didn't want it to face the street, but it could be in the back, and we didn't care that it was only in the basement. It could be, you know, along Exchange Place, perhaps in the back on the third floor, as an example. So we think storage needs to be everywhere. We were concerned about the SRO zones. A 10 by 10 room is pretty tiny. And if you're a mom with a couple of kids, well, that one's going to be 150 square feet. It's still tiny for all the stuff. You know that. So we think storage should be built in to most buildings. Then you don't have to drive to Murray or North Salt Lake.
Thank you, Judy. Is there anyone else here who would like to speak on this topic? Seeing no one, I'll close the public hearing. Bring it back up to the commission. Do we need Doug to come back up?
Yeah, I just want to follow up with Doug on that question that Judy asked. Is there something that would prohibit an apartment building from identifying an internal apartment of their own to be used as storage for their residents?
No, and in fact, a lot, for example, 99 West condos there on South Temple and West Temple. They have the big tower, but down buried in the parking lot, they have storage for individual units. The difference, that's on site, it's part of the development. So this petition is really for somebody to create a commercial storage complex to rent to the general public, as opposed to being exclusive to those residents.
Thanks.
So I'd like to make a motion. I think this is a great idea. It's an appropriate use of a bunch of basements that probably don't get used for much, or this is an alternate use for those basements. I think it's a great idea. I don't think anybody's gonna even notice a change in our living environment other than just having more storage. So this is regarding PLN PCM 2018-000645. Based on the information in the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to the City Council regarding this petition, and then with the condition that they be limited to the basement areas of the buildings only.
Good. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Amy? A motion by Clark, second by Amy. Andres?
Yes.
Clark?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Weston?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Agree.
Amy?
Yes.
And Brenda?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Good job. Okay, now we go to the work session. Sugar House Business District Design Standards. That's a
right.
mouthful.
So I'm here to brief you on the changes we're working on for the Sugar House Business District zoning, just to get your initial feedback on what we're looking at, on some of the potential changes that we're considering. So just for context, the Sugar House Business District zone is generally from 21st South to I-80, and you can see that on this map, and from about 9th East up to 1300 East. But it is split into two subzones. The Sugar House Business District 1 zone allows development up to 105 feet in height, and that's the properties in yellow. And the Sugar House Business District 2 zone allows for development up to 60 feet in height, so it's the lower of the two zones. So in the Sugar House Business District zone, there's also two routes for development permitting. If you're a small-scale development under 20,000 square feet in size and under 30 feet in height in the Sugar House Business District 2 zone, or under 50 feet in height in the Sugar House Business District 1 zone, you just go straight to permits for a development proposal. You do have to comply with basic zoning requirements and basic design standards. And design standards could deal with the percentage of glass on a ground floor, the materials on the front facade, those types of things, but generally measurable objective standards. The other route development can take is if you're a large-scale development over those size thresholds, you go to the Planning Commission generally. And that includes you meeting the zoning and design standards, the base standards, but you also have to meet the design review standards, which are generally a little bit more subjective than the measurable objective standards in the zoning code. And you also have to meet the design guidelines for the Sugar House Business District. And those design guidelines are 112 different guidelines dealing with everything from landscaping and sidewalks to the larger building form and architectural features of a building. So after you meet those on the Planning Commission approval, then you finally can go to building permits. So the issue in Sugar House is that small-scale developments don't really have a lot of design standards that they need to comply with. In fact, there's only really 3 or 4 design standards that they currently need to comply with, when we actually have a selection of 10 or 12 that could be applied to development in this zone. So the point of this is to take some of the more objective, measurable stuff in the Sugar House Business District Design Guidelines Handbook and put that into the zoning code in the design standards section. And a lot of our design standards link up pretty nicely with some of the guidance in the guideline book itself. So this is actually an extract from the design standards chapter that we have. A few years ago, we consolidated our design standards from various different zones into one section of the code to kind of standardize the language and make it easier to implement, make sure that we're being consistent about how we're applying these standards. So you can quickly see the stars and underlines indicate new standards that we're proposing to be applicable in the Sugar House zone. I can go into them in the next slide. So the first one is ground floor active uses. We're proposing that 80% of ground floors be occupied by an active use besides parking, and also applying a 25-foot minimum depth for those ground space uses. In the Sugar House zone, you do have to actually have specific uses. You could be residential, and there's a few commercial ones like art galleries, retail, restaurants, but there's no actual dimensional standards for how much of the facade actually has to occupy, and no dimensional standard for the depth of the space. So we're proposing minimum standards for that. We are considering a commercial requirement and on top of that for developments on Highland Drive and 21st South. mostly because generally those have been Sugar House's commercial corridors, where we do have a number of commercial businesses, and they may be being pushed out by our residential development that's happening right now or in the future. So that's one consideration when we're looking at. The other standard we're looking at is minimum entrance spacing. The Sugar House Business District Guideline Handbook actually calls for entry spacing of 30 feet, so an entry every 30 feet. We do kind of recognize that's a little tight. In our other zones, we've had numbers more like 40 or 50, so 30 may be a little too tight for some areas in Sugar House, so we're open to looking at that number some more. We're also looking at maximum building lengths, 300 feet length maximum for buildings, and you'd have to then put a pedestrian corridor or a break of 20 feet, and 5 feet minimum of it would have to be a pedestrian walkway. Then you could have another building. We're also proposing durable material requirements. Right now the numbers are 60 feet upper and 80% ground, and that generally is pretty reflective of higher quality development that we've seen in the city and in Sugar House. The other standard is service area screening, just so that loading areas of the buildings have to be screened with some architectural features or be located behind the building. And we also have this parking structure design standards that we could apply to development in Sugar House, and it's 7 different standards involving the ground floor uses on parking structures, how the actual floors are laid out, where the ramps are, the exterior materials, a lot of different things. So in addition to the design standards, we're also looking at a few zoning modifications as well. One of those is sidewalk widths. The guidelines actually specifically call for 8-foot sidewalk widths in the higher intensity areas of Sugar House and 6 feet in the slightly lower intensity areas of Sugar House. So we're proposing a standard 8 foot in our high intensity Sugar House zone, 6 feet in the lower one. We're also proposing a standard for street lighting. Street lighting generally is required in Sugar House, but it's not up front in the code, so it could come as a surprise for people, so we want to put it right up front so it's not missed. Other things are zoning allowances. We often have requests for wayfinding signage with new developments in Sugar House, but technically our wayfinding signage limits are limited to 4 feet in height, which really doesn't put these signs at eye level. So we're proposing a change that would allow them up to 6 feet, so they're actually eye level with pedestrians. We're also considering a park strip paving allowance. Currently, it's not clear whether you can actually pave your park strip, but in some areas of Sugar House, the Sugar House circulation and amenities plan actually calls for more plaza areas rather than grass park strips. So this would be an allowance as long as you actually met the circulation guidance in the plan, and that would have to be reviewed by the planning director to get special approval.
So would paving that park strip be part of that 6 foot or 8 foot sidewalk, or that would be in addition to the 6 foot or 8 foot sidewalk?
It potentially could be part of that if it was appropriate and called for in the circulation plan. Yeah. Another just clarification is that we do have some large paragraphs in the Sugar House Code, and so while we're making changes, we look at trying to make those regulations more clear, and there's a confusing thing about height limits, and we're looking at changing that into a table so it's easier to read. So on top of those standards, there are some 4 different existing design standards that apply in Sugar House. That's the 40% minimum glass requirement, the upper floor step backs that we see for buildings in Sugar House of 15 feet, lighting limits regarding the direction the lights can be pointed, and also maximum length wall lengths of 15 feet. So we only have a few design standards currently for small developments in Sugar House, and this would really look at beefing that up a little bit. Just to mention, we have worked with the Sugar House Community Council's Land Use Committee a few times and discussed this proposal. They did have some concerns with our original proposal for the entryway spacing. We were proposing looking at more of a 50 feet. They were concerned that was too wide, so right now we're back to the 30 feet currently. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or suggestions or discuss.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
I would love to talk to you about the 300-foot maximum building length.
I wonder why.
That seems like a lot, and I would love to see that much smaller.
Okay.
Like a lot smaller.
So in some of our other zones, we've set that at 200 feet. The TSA zone has been 200 feet. And I think our D2 proposal is 200 feet. The 300 feet does line up with exactly midway through some of our larger blocks, which is like 600 feet ish. So it is 660. So the mid-block walkways kind of would flow at 300 feet generally. I think that's why we looked at 300. And additionally, in the current conditional building and site design, that is a number. So we use that for guidance, but we're open to looking at smaller numbers. The reason for the width limitation in Sugar House would be to so that we get some of the pedestrian circulation, so we get breaks in the buildings and some pedestrian walkways. And you've seen that with a few larger developments that have come into Sugar House, where they've broken up the building when it's been longer than 300 feet for little walkways.
Yeah,
So-
and I really appreciate that you have the walkway component in there. I just think that the mass of a 300-foot building, the footprint of a 300-foot building is very large. And, you know, back to our discussion forever ago about, you know, that there are architectural ways to make a 300-foot building not look like a 300-foot building and make it look like two completely distinct buildings.
Sure.
And if that's something we can write into it, I'm absolutely fine with that.
Okay.
I just think it's more of that.
I'm not absolutely fine with that,
Oh, okay.
just for the record.
I mean, I think it would have to be done right so that it would be mistaken for two separate buildings, you know, if they are going to make it into one massive building. And I'd love to hear Brenda's. Were you here for that? Were you here when we talked about that? No. When we had the Dutch building, was it a Dutch building? Yeah. It's like, apparently it's a famous Dutch building. We looked at it. I don't remember what it was called. Huh? But it was a building, I don't know how long it was, really long, and it was one building. We see the same thing at City Creek. I mean, they did it in City Creek. A lot of those are massive buildings, but they've made them into look like they are separate buildings. Yeah. And I think that creates the visual interest that would happen naturally if we allowed zero setbacks and multiple buildings to be built right up against each other.
Which
so
would
it's
be
mimicking
better.
that, which would be better. I agree with that completely. But I don't know, like, I'm not a wizard on the economics of construction and development. And we have developers who come in here all the time and tell us it's just not feasible. We have to do this giant thing. And I don't know if that's true.
Blocks here is just so big.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what the size of the block is. You just put more buildings. How does that, I don't know how that changes the
Lot
scenario.
is, if you've got 660 square foot blocks and your lots are divided in that automatically sets the framework for what you're going to build. That's all I'm saying.
I don't know
If
what
you
you're
had smaller lots, you would have smaller buildings.
Yeah.
You'd have more and smaller buildings, but that's not how the city's laid out. That's my only point.
But the lots are not related to the block.
Sure they are.
Yes, they are.
But I mean, they don't have to be. There's no correlation between a lot size and a block size. You can have as small of lots as you want on a giant block.
I'm just saying historically, the pattern of how the city was subdivided was you've got big square areas with really wide streets, and they broke the blocks up and the lots within the blocks a certain way, and that's the pattern that's evolved, and that's what we're left with. That's why we, like the weird lot we got today. It was, I have a feeling it was consolidated at some point, but we just have these quirks in how we've established property lines, and that controls development.
Okay. I don't. That's fine. I don't care. What I care about is that we create some visual interest and not have giant beige buildings that you walk across or walk in front of for an hour.
So if a building did, for example, if we set it to 200 feet and a building wanted to go beyond that, they could still go through our conditional building and site design process to get a modification, and would be just encouraging them to put a walkway through if at 200 feet, if they're asking for a modification, but they could, through that process, look at alternative ways to break up the building.
The walkway is one solution, though, right? I mean, I don't think it needs to have a walkway every 200 feet, right? One walkway in 300 feet is fine, but just something so it's not, you don't have a single facade that is equivalent to 300 feet. Because I mean, the Sugarmont, when you go walk it, it feels long, and that sidewalk is narrow. Like it's one of my, I'll always remember that project. It feels long, it feels narrow. So I'm with Weston. Like, there's a way to shorten it. It doesn't mean there has to be a walkway every 300 feet. You know, maybe if there's a way they can get something, if they're putting a walkway in, so there's an incentive to it, maybe we go to 250 if they get to put a walkway in. But otherwise, it's shorter. I think 200 feet seems better, in my opinion.
Great.
So I have a few things,
Yeah.
Daniel, and I really liked your report.
Oh, thanks.
Like the way it was laid out, and I was like, oh, good, I'm breaking up with some visuals. This is awesome. So I wanted to hear from you what you consider to be a positive reason to expand the minimum entrance spacing from 30 to 50.
I think when we have a low standard, we could end up just with unused doors on facades. One retail space may end up having just an extra door that's just locked all the time, even though it's within the same space.
Oh, that's right. I remember reading that now. I think one of my feedback on that is, I don't know how you balance this. So in some way, what I hear a lot of in Sugar House and in various other places are these smaller businesses, and communities are very interested in trying to promote local, and they need smaller spaces, not bigger ones. So if we did every 30 feet, that would be promoting some more small kind of spaces that are conducive for local businesses to inhabit. But if you had it on every 50 feet, so I don't know, there's a balance in there somewhere, because I remember reading that rationale that you mentioned. Currently we have very little vacancy retail in Sugar House. So I don't know if there's a balance for kind of allowing the promotion of some smaller spaces that are conducive to those local ones that need it, but also trying to circumvent the possibility of locked doors.
Sure. I think that's a balance we're trying to find.
Yeah, be magic, Daniel.
Yeah.
That's all I need to know. I guess that's just some of my reasoning of why I would prefer a 30-foot minimum spacing, but I can see what you're saying. I also have concerns about the 300-foot maximum length, so you might want to look at that one a little bit more closely. Okay. And then two more things, and then I will be done. And I want to voice yes on the parking strip, allowing it to be paved. And I actually don't see a problem with that being, at some points, part of the 8 feet. I also really like the 8 feet on the sidewalks. But is there something in there that's going to prevent it from just being straight concrete? Or will it have some decorative, not that it has to be extremely elaborate, but stamped or something that just kind of gives it some more visual interest?
So the circulation plan actually has some standards about the standard brick and concrete paving, so you kind of see what that sort of looks like in this little
I was
graphic.
wondering if that standard would then be applied to if you were allowing it to be part of the 8 feet on the sidewalk. So if you had your 4 feet concrete sidewalk, then would that circulation plan standard for the paving be the parking strip? Or that's where I just get a little, I'm not sure if that standard in the circulation plan becomes part of that 8 foot sidewalk.
Yeah, no, we could certainly look at tightening up that language to ensure that if that park strip area is used, that they actually comply and do the brick concrete mix.
Yeah, even if
pattern.
Especially if it's going to be part of your 8 foot sidewalk.
Yeah.
still have some visual breakup. And then the last one, I don't know what is wrong with my brain, but I've read this so many times and I'm not quite sure I get it. And it's on the minimum glass requirements.
Okay.
So I'm sure when you explain it, I'll be like, oh, that was so dumb of me to not understand this. But so we have 40% ground floor facade between 3 and 8 foot height levels. It needs to be glass. And this is the part with visibility into the building at least 5 feet. 5 feet depth, 5 feet height.
5 feet depth, so there's not something behind the glass, just completely blocking your view, like
Okay,
shelving.
see, and I was just like, I don't know how I get this. Because this has been a big issue for Austin Sugar House. But if the 40% is allowed between 3 to 8 feet, they could technically do the 40% at like 7 to 8 feet along this big, long building. And then, which is what Walgreens did. Okay. So that 40% meant nothing in terms of pedestrian activation, in terms of seeing in anything, because it's a brick wall unless you're, 9 foot tall.
Yeah.
And so having some sort of requirement, specification, where anything above 5 feet is meaningless to me because I'm 5'2". So, yeah, I can't see that. So we had all these conversations with CVS about this same thing. Is somehow providing direction that this 40% glass requirement can be between 3 and 8 feet, and you can see in 5 feet in depth, but you need to have some other direction that's giving it, like, you can't put it all above 5 feet level, because then you're not activating the street. You're not enhancing that pedestrian experience.
Gotcha. We can certainly look at language that could accomplish that. I don't know that I've seen any right off the top of my head. That would do that, but,
yeah, and I mean, because we've seen it happen where it's bad, that became like the standard of like, oh, well, if we don't communicate that, no, the reason we want this is so that people can see in and people can be activated, then they'll do that. Okay, that's it. Thanks, Daniel. I think this was great. I'm really glad you're doing this, and I appreciate that report.
Thanks.
I think, so your report says that this is focused on small scale development in Sugar House, and a 300-foot wall and a 20,000 square foot building seems, and a 50 or 30-foot building seems huge to me still. So I think anything you can do to, add as many entrances and make things as tight as possible. I mean, it seems like you could just put a bunch of Toys R Us buildings in this area, and that would meet the standards that you're proposing. So what do we want to get out of this? And it seems like I hear Amy saying she thinks they want more small retail. So trying to make things limited or force them to break up a little bit, I think would be probably better.
Okay.
I think this kind of speaks to this a little bit, but the 25-foot depth for that, that's the street level activity
correct
box. Is that a standard that would suffice for a restaurant, or is there, you know what I mean, like, or is that not enough to have an active use? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, we went back and forth on this when originally we were just doing the design standards chapter. I think ultimately we ended up with 25 feet was kind of a compromise, where maybe you wouldn't necessarily get a big restaurant space with back, but you might get some of the smaller restaurant spaces. So it was kind of a balance toward requiring super deep.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, as long as it's big enough to get something, it's not going to be like an art gallery on the edge of a parking structure.
Yeah, no.
It's 10 feet.
For some
It's
random
8 feet
example.
wide.
Yeah, it's much wider than that. Yeah.
Okay.
5 feet is not very big.
It's
A
not.
normal storefront would be about, like a shopping mall would be about 25 feet wide and about 70 feet deep.
Oh,
It's 60 to 70 feet.
so that is not very
Because
deep.
there's a lot of area in the back.
But it's deep enough that a small, like, I guess kind of to the point of the local shops, like it's big enough that a local shop could thrive there in a 25-foot deep spot. That, I mean, okay, we'll survive. And then the active use, does it spell out exactly what, like, can it be the bike lockers for the apartment building? Can it be the office for the leasing office? Can it be the gym for the building? Or does it have to be public?
It could be any of those things, because we do allow residential, and if you're an accessory part of that residential, you could put it there, such as your front office, or where all the residents put their bikes. The restriction is really just parking can't be behind the glass. But that kind of goes to why we were looking at making them put in an actual commercial space, because sometimes you could fill that entire floor with just residential and accessory uses to that actual residential building.
So can we add a requirement then? So you're saying that your plan is to add a requirement that requires the commercial use?
At least for Highland Drive and 21st South.
Okay, right. Fair. Yeah, I think that's fair.
But otherwise, generally, we're not proposing more than that.
Okay. I mean, I would lean towards being as aggressive as possible in that regard to push for more public engaging spaces, but also understanding that that is complicated to do that everywhere. But yeah, would trust where you land on that. Yeah, and I would just say, kind of back to my length comment, if you're looking at I don't know, what's the Sugar Hole building called? Was it the actual name for it?
The View.
What is it?
The View.
The View, that's right. So like the view there that goes on 11th East, that feels like a long facade that's a little boring. But the 21st side, it's broken up into two buildings with the walkway, or I think two buildings.
No, they are. No, the View is one building, and then there's the walkway, and then a completely separately owned, not the same person building.
Right. Okay. Right.
So he didn't break up his building.
Which is fine, but like the look and feel, that's just a good comparison right on the corner of the look and feel that I think can be mimicked, whether it's the same owner or not. You know, and I don't know the lengths. I don't know if, but that to me, the one on 21st South is the look and feel that.
And I feel like that was mostly accomplished because of the circulation and streetscape amenities plan.
Oh, yeah, and it went through a public process. So that's the other thing, that we're not eliminating the public process, the design review process, and Molly actually took a new design review process to the Planning Commission a few months or maybe a year ago at this point. So those large buildings would still have to go through this more subjective review process, and they could look at breaking up the building facade for those long lengths of building.
So can you remind us what that design review process is and who does the design review?
The
What's
design
required?
So the design review. So if your building's over a certain size, it triggers that design review. And there's a number of different standards that you saw on the last building just went here.
Sorry, but
right.
I'm wondering what the process is.
So we send a notice to the community council, and they took a look at it, go through in Sugar House to go to the land use committee and then the wider body. Staff actually also at the same time is looking at the standards and looking at whether changes should be made to the building to better meet some of those standards. The community council then gives us a letter with their concerns. We also look at that and see if additional changes should be made to the building. We work with the applicant and then come up with a recommendation that goes to the commission. That cover the process?
Well,
okay.
That's the process, yeah.
Okay.
That still doesn't really answer who does it.
Planning staff, is that what you're?
I guess so.
Okay, yeah. So planning staff is looking at the standards and reviewing it and checking against the standards.
So it's not a special staff, it's just the project staff.
Right.
So does all of the project staff have design experience so that they can do a design review?
I think everybody has different backgrounds from planning school, but we do have an urban designer on staff that generally we consult with for any design review project to get their input. And we do have managers on staff that actually have urban design backgrounds as well to get their input. So when we get a project, we do look at it collaboratively and have the entire staff look at it, and including consulting one-on-one with some of our more experienced urban design professionals.
So if I can just summarize here, what you're trying to do here is to take you have like 4 standards now that are part of the zoning code. And you're trying to make more standards be part of the zoning code for the smaller developments.
Correct.
And you're adding which ones? Service area screening, building entrances, maximum facade length, parking structure design, minimum sidewalk width, and street lighting. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's
Or
about
is
right.
there
It's
more?
these 6 on
There were 4, and now you're going to have 10?
10, or and including some of the zoning modifications, 12 or 13.
And why are we doing this?
Because smaller developments in Sugar House might not necessarily meet the master plan ultimately when they're built, because we really don't have any standards for these developments. They could go in and they wouldn't reflect what we have in our master plan and what we want to see in Sugar House. And we generally haven't gotten a lot of small development, but we do want to get a little ahead of it, making sure that if we do get more small developments in Sugar House, that we're getting what we'd like to see.
Yeah, there's very few left other than the Shopko block that's going to be big. They're squeezing them into little spots. So I think you're right in that at some point, those are the things that are going to be more prevalent.
It's possible, yeah.
Because all of the bigger lots and parcels are getting done.
Can I ask another question that's probably incredibly dumb, and if it is, you can tell me to shut up. It's fair. So when I drive through Sugar House, and I do it a lot, there's parts of it that stick out to me as, at least in my mind, still being old Sugar House, and it's mainly the north side of 21st South. Right in this area, from like the Chipotle up to Amy knows the stores. You said them the other day.
Yeah, it's from Sterling Furniture to like Best Friends,
Yeah.
and well, Wells Fargo doesn't count, but Soup Kitchen.
Yeah.
To the Sugar House Pub, to the Commerce and Craft. Yeah, that particular part of 11th East.
Is there anything that can be done through this process that could help preserve those, at least like the pattern that they've developed? You know, that we talked about this a little bit when we did when we talked about the Dixon Medical, that is no longer the Dixon Medical, which was just south of the View. And you know, that they've got that sort of zigzag pattern of little shops. You know, I don't even know if this is something that would be in our purview at all, and I'm just taking this opportunity because we're talking about design in Sugar House to say that there's not a lot of elements left of old Sugar House, and we hear all the time from the community that they're sad that it's gone. And development is going to happen. And I just don't know if there's anything we can do through our process here that can help encourage the preservation. I mean, we may not be able to like say you have to preserve it, but encourage or give bonus points or something to help preserve that same sort of pattern, look, and feel that might be the nostalgia that people want in Sugar House.
I mean, so there's different ways. It depends what you're trying to preserve. If it's just simply the pattern, that kind of goes to standards like the entryway spacing. When it comes to pattern, often that's something we look at with historic preservation kind of standards,
Right.
where we're looking at the solid to void ratios on facades. We did look a little bit, or have, at preserving facades that would be significant here. But we have so few that are identified as landmark structures in this area. So that would require a survey to determine if there's any contributing structures here that with facades that contribute to a historic district. So there's ways.
Doesn't
to
sound
get
like
at
it's
certain
particularly
things.
through
No,
this
and I
process
think
at this moment.
The sad
Yeah.
thing is, really what kills that is all of that old town that you've described is zoned Business District 1, and it's the only parts that are Business District 1 north of 21st. All the other north of 21st is Business District 2, and there were political reasons for that, but those are the ones that would be subject to non-quaintness, as it were. So I think it would take looking at rezoning those. I don't know that there's design guidelines. If those got redeveloped, that would really help.
Anything else for Daniel?
I have a question about your sidewalk standards. To me, they're very small compared to any urban area where you actually have a lot of people. I mean, most urban area sidewalks are 16 feet wide. So why are we only at 8?
First of all, it was because of the design guidelines actually spoke to exactly what were wanted in Sugar House. Because they were so specific, we went with the 6 and 8 feet. But I do take your point that wider sidewalks may be more appropriate in very urban areas. I don't know that Sugar House is there quite yet. Maybe some central areas. One thing that did come up when we talked with the land use committee is that there may be areas where sidewalks should be much larger in Sugar House. And we do have a study going on with the transportation department that's actually looking at our street configurations and where wide sidewalks would be more appropriate. But we don't have specific guidance right now to say where in Sugar House it would be best to have the 10 feet. So we went kind of a simple path.
And why would you make that a building by building consideration? I mean, these are guidelines that apply building by building, right?
Right.
So why would you make the sidewalk width a building by building consideration instead of a, district-wide rule?
If there were, this would essentially be a district-wide rule, but we couldn't force existing buildings to just suddenly upgrade their sidewalks to 8 feet. And because improvements are done incrementally with every building permit we get what we're asking for at the time. So we may get little parts where there's an 8-foot sidewalk and then it goes back down to the 5-foot sidewalk. But until there's potentially funds to do expanded sidewalks throughout Sugar House, that's what we end up at.
It doesn't seem like it's even reasonable to put it in your guidelines because, you're going to have the sidewalk you have. On the other side of your building, it's going to be 5 feet. On that side, it's going to be 5 feet. On yours being 8 feet. I mean, why would that make any sense at all?
With existing development in Sugar House, with some of our large developments, they take up so much of the block that it actually has widened the sidewalks for
Right, but you're
entire
talking about
blocks.
small developments here.
But the other thing I guess I should point out is that these same basic zoning standards would apply to the larger developments as well. We'd be looking at these base standards. So they would apply to these larger developments. They would have to comply with the sidewalk width.
Right,
too.
but that's, but what I'm saying is that instead of complying with that, if they take that as their sort of, okay, 8 feet, when really you're saying, I would say in front of these larger buildings, especially ones that take up a significant amount of the space, should be much wider sidewalks. So, if you say 8 feet, you're kind of setting a limit versus, being more expansive.
And we could potentially look at language that links more to our circulation plan for larger developments that actually would say, no, this calls for wider sidewalks. So
Or say a minimum of 8 feet.
it is a minimum.
I know the communities want it around 10.
And
And if you don't put it in there, the developer won't do it. I've seen that happen multiple times.
And we can look at 10 feet. We generally go off the guidance in the master plan, but 2 feet
And
from
that's
8 feet
that
isn't that.
circulation plan, we were calling for 10 to
10 feet.
12, and they were like, let's compromise at 8. So it wasn't necessarily like the golden number. It was
Yeah.
just a compromise because I think the community's been clamoring for a lot wider.
And if you do have a park strip with anything in it, trees every 16 feet or whatever, that's got to be outside of the width of the sidewalk. The sidewalk's got to be a clear width.
And we could tighten up the language there too, to say that, yeah. Great.
Anything else? Thank you, Daniel.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now we'll move on to the low-density multifamily residential zoning standards briefing.
All right,
Hi,
hi
Lori
again. So tonight, we're going to be going over potential or text amendments that you'll be seeing again in the future, and we're calling them updates to our RMF 30 low-density multifamily residential zones. And there's quite a bit of information to go over, so I'll try to kind of go through quickly, but please feel free to stop me if you have questions. We really do want to get your initial feedback before taking this out to the public for comment, and then eventually refining the standards and bringing them back to you for a public hearing. So again, stop me whenever with questions or comments. So as you all are aware, facilitating new housing in our city is a top priority of our administration. Per the current 5-year housing plan, a major goal is to reach a point where all residents in Salt Lake City, current and prospective, regardless of race, age, economic status, or physical ability, can find a place to call home. So this goal is not only emphasizes creating more housing, but creating different types of housing for different people in different stages of their lives. So in addition to doing things like allowing different types of housing, for example, single resident occupancies, which you all recently reviewed, the housing plan specifically calls for the removal of restrictive zoning barriers to creating new housing. And so for some time now, planning staff has recognized that some of our zoning standards within our city's multifamily residential districts in particular, or we refer to them as our RMF districts, so standards in those districts that were first established in 1995, they can tend to be quite restrictive and even hamper creative housing solutions. So with that, we are starting to propose these text amendments to our RMF zones. We have 4 RMF zones, and we're going to start with the RMF 30 tonight, which is our low-density multifamily district. So I'll be going through the proposed updates, which includes introducing design standards for new construction in these districts, allowing new housing forms, including cottage developments and side-oriented row houses, allowing multiple buildings on a lot, allowing lots without street frontage, amending some lot width requirements, and amending some lot area requirements. So before jumping into all those very specific changes, I do want to just generally show you where the RMF 30 districts are located in the city, which can be found, or they're centralized kind of just north of the Liberty Park area or west of the university. And then there's also a handful in our Sugar House neighborhood, in particular just east of 7th East. And so this map shows all of our multifamily residential parcels. And so 1,028 of our 3,212 multifamily residential parcels are RMF 30. So the RMF 30 make up about a third of all of our multifamily residential parcels. I also want to explain that with these updates, the city is looking to encourage missing middle housing in particular. Missing middle housing is not a new type of housing, but it's housing that exists in our city today, like duplexes, triplexes, row houses, and small-scale apartment buildings. These types of housing forms can accommodate more housing units while remaining compatible with lower density development. Missing middle housing also tends to have smaller footprints. The units tend to be smaller, and that keeps their prices down. The problem is that it can be difficult to construct these specific forms of missing middle housing in our RMF districts in particular. So here are just a few examples of existing missing middle type housing in our city that really tend to fit in with existing lower density neighborhoods, but also provide higher unit counts. Just for your reference, the Central City Master Plan calls for 20 units per acre, which equates to 2,170 square feet per unit. So that's what our future land use plan calls for these types of low density zones. So here you can see at 825 South, 800 East, this is a cottage type development, and it currently exists with 12 units, which it equates to about 1,452 square feet a unit. However, if we were to apply the current RMF 30 standards, this site would be allowed only 5 units. The second example at 620 South Park Street, this is a more...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you tell me why it only allows 5?
So, yes, so the current standard for lot area per unit is 3,000 square feet per unit. So that would be applied here.
Thank you.
The second example is a traditional row house at 620 South Park Street. This coincidentally has similar stats. So there's 12 units on this lot. It's about 1,490 square feet a unit. And again, it would only allow 5 units per current standards. Here's an example of some more traditional apartment buildings at 688 East, 700 South. There are 16 units in these buildings, in both of these buildings combined, 16 total. That equates to 527 square feet per unit. And per current standards, this couldn't be constructed today because a multifamily building requires at least 9,000 square feet for the first 3 units, so a multifamily building couldn't be constructed here. They could have a duplex at 8,000 square feet, but not multifamily. And then the last example I wanted to throw in something more current at 1712 South 900 East, the Blue Koi kind of row house development, and there are 20 units on this site. It equates to 1,633 square feet per unit, and per current RMF 30 standards, they would be allowed half of that, or 10 units. All right, so now diving into each of the changes. The first update is to introduce design standards for all new construction in our RMF 30 district. These standards being applied are actually the same standards that exist in the city's form-based zoning districts today, which require design features like front entries, front facade glass, higher quality building materials on the front facades of buildings, second floor balconies, and they also limit the length of blank walls on buildings. The second update is to allow specifically these new building forms, including cottage. Go ahead.
Sorry, go back. So second floor balconies are required
Yes.
in RMF 30 zones and are proposed.
So these standards we're taking directly from our existing form-based districts, and they are required now, second floor.
Why require a second floor balcony?
I think it's just more eyes on the street, more visual interest. things of that nature, more articulation. But yeah, it is specifically required for form-based. So, but if you, that's something that maybe, if you
I mean, I'm
feel,
not opposed to second floor balconies, but requiring them.
we can certainly look into maybe, because obviously our form-based districts are centralized in certain neighborhoods, and they might be.
A lot of modern developments, it makes sense, but if you're
Sure.
redoing some older developments, it wouldn't make sense to have a second floor balcony. Anyway, I just to require it seems odd to me. I don't know.
I would agree, and I would think, I would want to balance these additional design requirements with whether you're creating additional barriers to development.
Yeah.
If the
They're
point is
too-
to make alternative development patterns possible and to increase affordability and to get more variety in the housing stock, I don't know that we might be counterbalancing that goal.
Definitely.
Maybe they could be more like encouraged or suggested than required, perhaps.
Sure.
I mean, I like
design guidelines versus
Yeah.
design standards.
If there is a reason that they should be required, I'd just love to know what
I mean,
that
if you
is.
do a traditional house-like looking thing on the front of, it's not gonna have a second floor balcony. You know, It's gonna have something, so I don't think that that's important to anything that we're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's something that staff questioned too, so I'm glad you brought that up. We can further look into that and see if it's truly appropriate in these
Look at
areas.
I mean, I would also get, I'm trying to think of like my house, like I doubt my house has got 20%. And I'm a big street facing facade person, as you guys may, from my comments, but, I don't know if the 20% makes sense or not. I have no idea. I'd have to like look at my house and see if but give some examples and just dig in to make sure the 20% makes sense.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the second update is to now allow these specific housing forms, including cottage developments, which are now permitted in our form-based districts. And these are developments where you have kind of these smaller, single-family detached houses on one lot.
Are they like tiny homes?
So they're
A home commune or something?
a bit like tiny home. I don't know how everyone defines tiny, but these will be limited to 850 square feet per unit,
Minimum. That would be the minimum.
maximum.
Oh, that's the maximum.
Yes.
So they are tiny homes.
Yeah, that's about the size of my home, so.
That's a pretty substantial, house. That's what the house, those post-war housing, Levittown houses,
uh-huh.
those are 800 square feet.
Really?
Yeah,
That's one level or two levels? I mean, 800,
one level.
The footprint, sorry, the footprint.
1,500.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Oh,
It's the
yeah.
footprint that's
Oh,
limited,
okay.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah, that's not that is big.
Smaller than Weston's house, maybe.
That's big. That is bigger than my previous house, which was plenty big. I am actually really interested in creating a space for tiny homes to
Yes, yeah.
to exist.
You don't mean tiny homes. Tiny homes are like 150 square feet.
No, I
or
mean, yeah, but I would like
200
to see
square
that.
feet
I
or
think that would
whatever.
be. I think that would be a great addition
We
to the housing
did-
stock.
We did consider adding a third housing form, a tiny house type of form, but weren't sure if that was super compatible with our RMF districts in particular, but if that's something you want to explore, we can certainly do that.
I mean, it was one of the first things that happened to me when I got on the commission is I had somebody approach me and they have a very active community and wanting to, but they can't build their homes tiny
Right.
homes anywhere because nowhere allows them or nowhere
Or
did.
we require a 5,000 square foot lot
Right,
per,
exactly. And
Sure.
so they were very interested in finding a space to do that. And I don't know how that's any different than allowing duplexes and triplexes if we're going to just have, 4 or 5 freestanding tiny homes on a lot.
Another example is like when you go to IKEA, you see this really cool floor plan that's only 650 feet,
I know, and you're
square
like,
feet.
I
And
want
you're like, oh,
that.
this is really cool. but good luck getting it passed, right? So all the regulations. So actually, this is kind of welcoming. I think a lot of people would see it as a welcome addition.
You have a cottage development, it doesn't have to be as big as 800 square feet or 850.
No, you can
It
have-
make it 350 or 400 if you
Sure.
want.
Yeah.
If you are just going to live there by yourself and not be there very much.
Yeah, and so the idea with these cottage developments is we feel that these could accommodate more units on one lot and be compatible with our existing RMF neighborhoods. The same goes for the side, we're calling these now side-oriented row houses, or just row houses that are flipped to be oriented towards the interior of the lot versus the public street, which you review quite often. So we are proposing to allow these with additional design standards. So, of course, these aren't allowed per current standards without a plan development approval. And a lot of times with these plan developments, we really try to get these types of housing forms to front the street, to be broken up, things of that nature. So with these side-oriented row houses in particular, we are proposing additional design standards in addition to the design standards that will be applied to all new construction. So of course, they'll have to have a front entry oriented to the street, a little bit more glass. The interior facades will have to have a 20% glass. Garage doors cannot face the street on these types of units. The side units will need to be delineated in some fashion, which we're trying to work through right now. So if you have ideas on kind of trying to delineate the side units, please let us know. And so those are the types of design standards that we'd like to apply, and then in lieu of having these be reviewed as plan developments.
I think the bigger issue you have with many of these is that, one, obviously the street-facing facade, and then two, what happens on the back side of the house that neighbors a neighboring property. The back, the side yard, right? The short side yard where you got the driveway on one side, and so then you've got someone else's house here, and you just have a wall. And so I think trying to figure out how we mitigate that wall.
Is there a minimum width for this kind of lot, for this kind of project?
If they're all on the same lot, it would be 50, let me look at the proposal. I think it's a 50-foot wide lot.
50 foot?
This is your side-oriented development? It says
Side-orient.
80 feet.
How much?
80 feet
That would include like a driveway,
the width
though,
of the
right?
width
Of a lot.
of the lot.
Lot. Is
Yeah,
80
so-
feet minimum?
That's
80-foot minimum, how wide do we require, like the driveway?
Oh, currently, they're required to have 80 feet.
Oh, okay.
And then we're proposing to reduce that to 50.
And would that include the driveway?
Yes.
Have we
Lot width.
studied that
And
to make
and
sure that
how
works?
wide do we require the driveway?
Well, it could, typically for fire requirements, 20 feet. So
We'd potentially be looking at 30 feet.
for the front of one unit.
Would this have a setback? Would it have to have?
5-foot side yard setback.
So for this new form, side-oriented row houses in particular, we're looking at doing a 10-foot setback on either side, applying the same rear yard setback and the same front yard setback. So we're kind of trying to beef up those side yard setbacks to create more of a buffer.
So if, I'm going to do the math. So if we have 50 feet, 20 feet of that is driveway. 10 feet of that over here is buffer. You've got a 20-foot wide building.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so 50 feet, of course, is the minimum. It could be wider.
Oh, that's the minimum. Okay.
Yeah, that's the minimum lot width. Right.
So, okay, that makes more sense. And I agree with Matt. I think a lot of our consternation with these slot homes is what we're considering the back wall, because the developers always go, well, that's that's like the rear of the house. We don't really care about that, but it's really not because it's a side.
Yeah.
And you can see it from the street. Not only do you usually have some occupant on the other side, but people who are walking and driving, it is very visible. So it's not really a back
Of
as
course,
we
yeah.
typically and traditionally look at that. And so, yeah, and we've seen some really bad examples of how that can turn out. And I think we need some very specific, or at least we need some guidelines for that, because that's something that we've struggled with as well. And, you know, I have some angst in allowing this to be permitted just because we've seen such a variety of these things come forward. And they're all really bad. And nobody's getting it yet of what we're trying to accomplish. And so I'm afraid that the design guidelines will basically allow somebody. The other thing we're concerned about is that front facing. So we're concerned that I don't want somebody to be able to just slap a door and then a little walkway and call that a front entrance, because that's, to me, the intent of having it engaged to the street is engagement, is having it feel like it's a home that you're doing. And so I have angst with allowing this to be permitted instead of going through a review by the Planning Commission, simply because I don't know if the answer is to have such tight guidelines that you're getting to the intent of what we've been trying to accomplish. I don't know if that's feasible. I don't know if that's preferable. I don't know if that's possible. But I'm concerned with what somebody could get away with doing a bare minimum, and if that meets the intent of what we're trying to accomplish, which is that engagement. Because there's no one solution. Slapping a porch on it doesn't work for everything. They should have flexibility to design that to what's meeting, you know, what they want to do. But we've seen too many, yeah, I'll put a door there.
Right.
And you want a walkway? Okay, fine. And that's all you get. The other question you had of delineating side entrances, one of the things that I have felt a lot is that side entrance with the parking, with the garage, has felt almost like a warehouse, and then there's a door, and in the warehouse there's a door. And delineating that you could do with lighting, with, you call it a porch light, but I realized there's no porch, so just a light. But that's delineating, hey, this is a separate entrance, a little portico that sticks out, not a huge one. That also helps delineate each individual unit so that it doesn't feel just like this wall of garage door, garage door,
Right.
which ultimately feels just kind of warehousey to me. And so I don't know if you feel, or staff feels like you can accomplish the things we've been struggling with since I've been on the Planning Commission with these slot homes in design review. I think it needs to be a lot tighter or a lot longer than this.
Some things are a little bit objective, that there needs to be a reviewer or a commission.
Yeah, and so that's where I'm struggling with allowing this to just be something that's permanent, because I also feel like sometimes staff gets limited and like, okay, well, they met it. Okay, you're good. And then I would look at it and be like, wait, that did not accomplish anything.
Yeah.
And so I feel like sometimes staff is constrained with those limitations, whereas we can more flesh out.
Sure,
Are you
totally
getting to this
understand.
intent? So I don't know where the balance is. I don't know. I'm struggling with that, and that's why.
Yeah, and we're trying to find that balance as well. One thing I will say is another update to this is we're trying to allow lots without direct public street frontage through instead of a planned development, through some sort of administrative, maybe staff level review, like a special exception or a conditional building and site design. So these types of housing forms, the side-oriented row houses, almost always have lots without street frontage. So therefore, we would probably send them through this more administrative type review, which could be kicked up to the Planning Commission. So that's another element of this.
Yeah, I'd like to see that a little bit, some more attention paid to how those things would happen. I personally am not against any of these different design modifications and allowing these different type of configurations. I think it's wonderful, actually. It allows for flexibility, it allows for a lot of different designs. I'm just concerned with the things we've already been struggling with.
Definitely.
That I don't know that we even have the best answers because everyone is so different. But I'd like that fleshed out a little bit more so I feel confident that staff had the direction and captured the intent of what we're trying to do and wasn't necessarily constrained by just a bare minimum that sometimes I think happens.
Sure. Thank you.
I think that really ought to look at that minimum with, again.
Yes.
It's not going to work. Just check it out here. So it's just, need to test it.
Okay.
We ought to look at the 4 or 5 of these that we've actually approved already, and even conceiving of them as, you're looking at something that might be a 20 by 20 foot footprint. That's how big a garage is. Not very big.
Okay, we will.
Also, square is very awkward.
Okay, we'll definitely look at that for these forms.
It might have to be another, you're saying it's 80 now, and that may be too much, but
A
it might
better
really need to be
balance.
6. I mean, 60 is a pretty common width, isn't it, for these lots? Didn't you did a,
Yeah,
what I thought was
based
a
on
fine
the
job
distribution.
analyzing that, yeah.
Yeah, up to 60, and then it kind of gets fewer and fewer are wider than 60 feet.
But
Yeah.
60 is sort of your median, or
Yeah.
would you say? Or do you know what your median is? Because that would be a good place
Indicator.
to start this, is what the size of lots that we actually have.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll definitely look at that.
That's right.
It's not swayed.
Mike?
Do I need to repeat that again? Sorry.
I got, or I guess the record didn't get.
Sorry, median would be better than me.
Perfect. Okay, we'll look at that for sure. Okay, moving on. Another thing we'd like to do is allow more than one principal structure on a lot. So right now, if you want more than one principal structure in any sort of configuration, for example, like you see here, you would have to go through a planned development process. And initially, this standard might have been in place to kind of limit poor visibility and poor access to properties in the rear of lots, especially for kind of safety purposes. But there are lots in the city that have adequate access and have adequate visibility to do some sort of development in the back. This is just a lot I happened to walk by, and I saw there is a 2-family structure behind a 4-plex in the front. And so this today isn't permitted without a planned development. So we'd like to allow this in RMF districts, again, in different sorts of configurations.
So Lauren, I have a question. Near my house, probably about 10 years ago, maybe 12, on Garfield Avenue and about, 1150 East, the home got torn down and they built a duplex with, garage in the front, just very suburban-ish, far back. And then they built another duplex in front of it probably a year and a half later.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't as involved in stuff at that time, and so I don't remember. I'm sure it went through some type of a review. Is that something that would be allowed in this configuration?
To build something in front of an existing structure?
Well, they ended up tearing it down, built that, and then they probably felt like, oh, we can do this other one, we have room. It came later. Is that, because this is like, oh, you have a home in front, we want to build in back, but would it allow like a tear down and to build 2 separate?
It would. And so this is a balance we're trying to strike here. We're trying to increase housing units in our city, but we also recognize that we need to preserve our existing housing stock, especially affordable housing stock and historic housing stock. So with that, I'll talk about this a little later on, but we're trying to propose a unit bonus where if you preserve or retain the existing structure on the lot, you could potentially get a unit bonus of one more unit than the square footage of your lot could accommodate if you retain the existing structure on the lot. But I also think we need to review lot area and kind of strike a balance between what we're starting to allow and how we can make sure that that existing housing stock remains, if that makes sense. And then along those same lines, which I already kind of touched on a bit, we would like to allow the creation of lots without street frontage, which you see a lot as per your plan development reviews. And again, we see this in the side-oriented row houses, but lots could be created in different configurations. And then we would have additional standards for these lots created without street frontage, and we're trying to figure out if this is something that could go through a special exception process, go through conditional building and site design that has more design standards, or if this is something that, if you want to weigh in on, if you feel that you would like to continue to review these creation of lots without street frontage.
So what's the purpose of the lot without street frontage? What is the purpose of allowing for the creation of lots without street frontage versus what's already allowed and is approved? Like, what change are you recommending here?
So right now, if you want to create a lot without street frontage, it needs to be approved per a plan development. So in terms of just process and cost, that can be hindering, I suppose. And I think there's lots that are able to accommodate lots without street frontage that have adequate access and adequate visibility. And so instead of having them go through a planned development to do that, which again is, a lot of it is the expense of it, there's also the time, but it would just be kind of done or reviewed with specific standards at the staff level.
So have you proposed those standards, or you?
Yes. I don't have them in the PowerPoint, but in the memo, they're attached. With all of the updates. So there's a specific section on page 2 of the updates. So some of the standards would be the lots without direct public street frontage must be associated with the construction of new buildings, the creation of lots that do not have adequate access to public streets, to a public street through access easements or a shared driveway shall not be permitted. So a staff member would kind of analyze that. We would route these to other city departments for review, and if they feel like it's not meeting their standards, we would also analyze that. They would need to submit a disclosure of private infrastructure costs for any common area. So just to maintain common area, that often happens with these planned developments where there's multiple lots, but then there's some excess common area. We would review that. And then they would be required to have design standards just like any of the other new construction projects. So those are the kinds of things we're considering reviewing for the creation of lots without street frontage.
So would the access easements be part of the plat? They'd be approved on the plat?
Well, yeah, and that's one thing. If these will probably be reviewed in conjunction with a subdivision. So yeah, we could make that a condition to
I would think it would need to be on the plat, so you don't
record that
have-
on the plat. Okay. But in general, I guess I can ask this now, do you feel like this is appropriate for administrative review or something that you'd like to keep seeing as planned development?
I would say that I would like to see it as planned development because there's still so many different configurations, especially when you change the lot areas as you're contemplating doing here, that could be totally messed up. And not that the staff wouldn't be able to recognize that it's totally messed up. They would probably, but I think it's helpful for us to see those for at least the short term until it sort of settles down to see how these come out.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with that. I feel I'm still erring on, or I'm citing on, I still want to review them just because they are just all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that you would be able to come up with design standards that I felt captured everything just because they're all over the place.
Right.
And if we don't see these, what would we be doing? We'd be
That's
going
true.
home at 7. I mean, I think staff is totally capable of that. It's just at this point, they're just still really bad, but some are really bad and some are like so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess until we start seeing a little bit more conformity in terms of what people are doing, I hesitate to try to promote that staff put together such dense guidelines that there reduces that flexibility. And I don't know that you could get to it without that kind of level of guidelines right now.
Yeah.
Because projects are all over the place.
Right. And trying to come up with these design standards, it is hard to pinpoint what makes a good design for these and what.
Exactly. And I don't know that that's achievable.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know that it's desirable.
Okay.
Really.
Yeah.
From a staff point of view, if you are burdened with a design guideline that is this thick and you're trying to evaluate, I don't know that that's a desirable method at this point. And so I'm leaning more towards wanting to still have them be planned development. Not because I don't think staff is capable at all. I think that the policy and procedure of the design guidelines would be so immense right now.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, so moving on, we would also be updating lot width requirements. So for single-family homes, the current standard is 50 feet, which would be taken down to 40 feet. For row houses, when they're on their individual lot, that would go from 25 feet to 15 feet. 15 feet is the width standard in our existing form-based districts. And then for multifamily units, which we feel is really out of line with the lot widths that we see in the city, that would go from 80 feet to 50 feet. And again, these are all minimums. And I do feel that there's other zoning controls on lots in terms of setbacks, lot coverage, things of that nature that would encourage more spacing and the same type of thing that lot width does. So that's kind of the idea behind that. Just as an example here, we have a 10,300 square foot lot, vacant lot, and then it has 63 feet of width. So this lot could actually not have multifamily on it without going through plan development approval because it doesn't have that 80 feet of width. So those are the lot width changes. And then along the same lines, we're looking at reducing lot area. So I think the biggest change would be for what are currently single-family attached units are required to have 3,000 square feet per unit, and then we are proposing to bring that down to 15,000 square feet per unit, which aligns with the requirement in our form-based districts. And then for single-family, we would go from 5,000 square feet to 3,000 square feet. Two-family units would go from 8,000 to 6,000 square feet, and the idea there being trying to keep the 3,000 square feet consistent per unit.
So yeah, I would actually think that one could go a little lower.
Okay, that's a question we had for single and two-family.
Two-family.
Two-family in particular.
And single, yeah, actually. I think those could go a little lower.
Okay. And then we would keep the 3,000 square foot requirement for multifamily units. We would definitely like to reduce this requirement for the RMF 35, 45, and 75 districts. But right now we're keeping that 3,000 square foot requirement. And so if you have any input on that for multifamily forms.
You give an example of, I mean, I'm assuming most of multifamily buildings that exceed that at this point? That where it's, less?
Yeah, so we looked at those forms earlier. Right here, this lot is the same lot we looked at the width, 10,300 square feet. It can currently accommodate 3 units. And then if you just look to the units right beside it, those lots are about 5,100 square feet, and they exist with 6 units, so double what that vacant lot could have. So with the proposed standards, they would still only be able to have 3 multifamily units, but if they did a row house or cottage development at 1,500 square feet per unit, they could have 6.
So it doesn't make sense to me, why would you be keeping the 3,000 square foot for the multifamily versus these other new types?
Well, we're trying to encourage these specific types of housing that are compatible with lower density development. But we can definitely look at slightly reducing those to better match what the density that's existing.
Fewer apartment buildings, more duplexes.
Yeah, that are broken up. And this is for, again, the RMF 30 district in particular. And then we would really look at reducing those for the 35, 45, and 75.
Does the RMF zone, RMF 30 ever have like neighbor like the R1 5000s or any of those sort of zones, or not really?
Sorry, say that again?
Does the RMF 30 ever frequently neighbor like the R1 5000 or any of those other kind of more traditional
I would say
residential homes?
so, yeah, I would say so. I guess we can't really tell looking at these maps, but well, this off of 7th East there, I know that all of those RMF 30 abut a large single-family neighborhood. I think it's kind of more of a mixed bag in Central City, but yeah, they do tend to abut.
Does it make sense to do anything about neighboring zones, or no? I have no idea. I'm not. I think there's if an RMF 30 zone neighbors an R1 5000, like is it directly adjacent? Is there any additional, do all these standards make sense, or should we try to discourage more multifamily or whatever, right neighboring, when adjacent to an R1 5000? Because that's the lowest residential. Is that the smallest residential lot?
Yeah.
5,000?
Yeah, that's something we can definitely look at. So you're saying if they didn't abut single-family residential, maybe they could accommodate higher densities.
Yeah, or maybe these are too low if it's next to an adjacent R1 5000. I don't know. It's just something to kind of play out and really look at where these places might intersect and touch at the current.
Okay.
On the current map.
So would you say that the RMF 30 are mostly in areas that are currently single-family or duplexes or some other kind of low scale?
I would say half and half. So of the RMF 30 land use types, about half of the lots have single-family homes on them.
Okay.
The blocks just above Liberty Park, those are very single-family oriented. But then the Central City area is definitely more of a mixed bag that could handle higher density.
And maybe it's even like, like we talked about the blank wall. I mean, if it's next to a residential house, it's different than if it's next to another apartment building or another blank wall, right? I mean, if you have two blank walls facing each other, maybe you can go down to 5 feet setback, but you need a 10-foot setback when you're next to an R15, a residential district.
maybe
maybe,
if you-
maybe there's things you can play with in that sense to help
Yeah.
address some of these other concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what it seems like these slot homes that we've dealt with are ones when they're neighboring a more traditional residential house that they're like, I don't want that going next to me, just have a wall in
Right.
my backyard.
Right, yeah.
But if
We
if
can-
they're all are, if we're gonna get a bunch of these slot homes or what do you call them, sideways turned townhomes?
Side-oriented
That's very articulate. I'm
row
really tired right now.
houses.
Yeah, sideways turned row houses. But it might make, I see if you have multiple houses, one development backing another development, then it's different. And so if you
Yeah,
have
I
a lot of
definitely see
a
what
lot of
you're
those in
saying there,
an
yeah.
RMF 30, it might make sense to the whole area unless you're neighboring a
Okay.
residential district.
It may make sense to, once you get, to have a sense of what this is actually intended to do, so that you do discourage the apartment house kind of type, and only have these in areas where there's clearly some strong relationship to single-family housing. So you might even change some of the zoning in certain areas to be denser or less dense, depending on its location relative to other things that
Yeah.
are going on, once you get the standards finished.
Yeah, we'll definitely look into that. And I will also say that we do realize by changing the area and reducing it for these different forms, we're putting more development pressure on existing lots with single-family homes. And so I think that's another reason why we're hesitant to drop the multifamily requirement down. It's
But, over time, Central City is gonna all be upzoned. Just the nature of Salt Lake and people moving and any other major city, a zone like that, it's just gonna get upzoned over time.
Yeah.
Because of its proximity and location. It's just,
Yeah. So, exactly. So we're trying to strike this balance here and preserve what we have, but allowing more housing. So, that's another reason for these numbers, but we'll try to do some more analysis. And then the last thing, just I mentioned before, in terms of that same idea of trying to preserve existing housing units, we're trying to come up with some sort of housing bonus for when someone comes in with a permit to add an additional unit on a lot. If they're proposing, for an example, like a basement apartment unit or a unit in the attic, and they're preserving that existing structure, at the time of the permit, we're proposing to allow a housing bonus. And based on the number of units you're retaining, the unit bonus will be proportional. So the idea behind this, with the new changes, those lots with single-family homes, there are 140 lots between, I believe, 6,000 square feet and 7,999 square feet that with the changes could now add one additional unit. So instead of demolishing the existing house, our hope is that this bonus might say, let them add an internal unit, an external unit, and then if they're retaining that house, on top of that, they'll get a bonus. So that's kind of the idea behind that. We're still trying to work out all the logistics.
So they would get another unit, so they get 2 units instead of 1.
Well, so it would be at the time you come in for a permit for a unit that's permitted, like it's permitted based on your area, they would get a unit on top of that. So it's not just everyone gets a unit, it's when you're adding a unit to a lot.
And
How does this different than ADUs?
It's similar.
That was my question, yeah. Like, what
Well-
makes
Way
this
of getting
different than
around
an
the
ADU?
ADU issue?
But ADUs are for single-family homes, and these could be applied on lots with,
Duplexes
Or single.
so you wouldn't have to be the primary resident would not need to live in the building either.
no, we don't have any sort of standards like that for these multifamily areas, yeah. So we're still trying to work out again, all the logistics. But if you have any general comments about that.
I wonder if that would have worked. I don't know if it was an RMF 30 zone. I'm thinking back, Sarah would know which I'm talking about, but the one was this kind of the old building that they're going to tear down and put like 5 units in the back.
Yeah.
I wonder if this sort of a thing would, and a lot of us expressed, oh, I wish you would have kept that front unit.
That's not gonna.
That building was coming down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I
And
generally
that's the idea.
Yeah.
Is if they could work to preserve a building and get an additional, maybe that would pencil out for them to do that, so.
Right. I mean, and I'm wondering, I guess in the vein of that other building, I wonder if there's other standards that could be relaxed to meet that same goal. And I don't know if that's opening it just too big of a door, but it seems like if we really, especially with the affordable housing component, like if we're really looking at, this is a great way to preserve affordable housing stock in these older buildings, then maybe it is worth creating even more incentives for people to maintain those units while they're building on other units. I don't know how valuable those, from an affordable housing standpoint, those units are.
Well, I think they're
in the city,
also valuable for character.
Yeah, for sure.
When we talk about
Absolutely.
compatibility, we talk about character, and that's a really big deal in terms of
Yeah.
what new things we're seeing.
Well, almost
so.
back to my sugar house thing, like I wonder if there's a way you can incentivize developers to maintain the facades of those historic structures
I
by
hope there is.
throwing everything at, let them do whatever else they want as long as they keep those those things.
I like the idea of an incentive to keep the original structure, because I feel like it does then meet these additional things. When we talk about affordability, but also we talk about a character of the neighborhood, which is always part of the standards as well. So I think that that's a great approach.
Okay.
Yeah, and there might be other things you can tack onto that too to try to get it, but I like the direction.
Okay.
I have a question about, hopefully it's not tangential, but what's the city's regulation on, what is it called, land strip? You know, the area between the sidewalk and the curb?
Yeah, the park strip.
So does there have to be like a certain amount of green on there, or can that all be cemented?
It has to be a third vegetation. Is that correct,
vegetation.
Molly?
I believe it has
Or
to
30.
achieve 30% vegetated ground cover within 3 years or something like that. And there's limitations on the concrete in the park strip. There's limitations on how close concrete or other things can be to an existing or proposed street tree, et cetera, et cetera.
The reason I ask is because in the RMF zones, there's a lot of areas that have a really big parking strip, maybe like 10 feet.
Right.
And so I don't know if it's something that you guys can look at later. I mean, nothing that's probably related to this particular, but just wanted to suggest it out there for.
Yeah,
The park strips are usually part of the city street. So
Right.
are you thinking that you could build on that? Well, you
No,
can't.
no. I was saying, as to like maybe relax the 30% regulations, or I don't know, something where you can.
Like an incentive.
Yeah, like an incentive of some
I
sort.
see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. To use it as some kind of leverage or something for what you guys are, for what we're trying to accomplish here.
Great. Okay,
Thank you.
so that was really it. I have these questions, but I think we've gone through pretty much all of them. So thank you so much.
Well, I guess, Lauren, you don't get to go through your whole presentation before we interject, right?
What?
You can't get through a whole presentation without us interjecting.
No, and it's way better that way, right? Because now we got all the questions.
Thank you for all
Yeah,
that.
thank
That's
you
great.
so much.
I think we're done. I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.